She walked into the ballroom like a woman who had already survived the worst they could throw at her. And she had. 3 years ago, they watched her leave London in silence. No farewell, no mercy, just cold shoulders and colder smiles as they buried her name under a mountain of whispers. Now she was back. Same room, same chandeliers, same cruelty dressed in silk and pearls. But Evelyn Hartwell was not the same woman. The question wasn't whether London would accept her. The question was whether she would bother letting it. Drop a comment below. What city are you watching from? And if this story grips you, stay until the end. You won't regret it. London, 1864. The carriage wheels hit the cobblestones of Mayfair at 7:30 in the evening, and Evelyn Hartwell didn't flinch at the sound. She'd been sitting with her spine straight and her hands loose in her lap for the better part of 2 hours, watching the countryside bleed into city through the rain-streaked window, preparing herself the same way a soldier prepares before marching into enemy territory. Not with excitement and not with dread, but with the cold, quiet discipline of someone who understood exactly what was coming. London. She'd been gone for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew the number without trying. It had lived in her chest like a splinter, never quite enough to be unbearable, never small enough to forget. The city came into view slowly, the way bad memories always do. Lamplight bled orange through the mist. Carriages clattered past hers in the opposite direction, their passengers hidden behind curtained windows. Street vendors were folding up their carts. A woman in a gray dress hurried along the pavement, clutching a basket to her chest, head down against the drizzle, looking like someone who knew better than to make eye contact with anything after dark. Evelyn pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass and watched her until she disappeared around a corner. That used to be me, she thought, ducking my head, pretending I didn't exist. Never again. Her lady's maid, a sharp-faced young woman named Clara, who'd been with her for only 8 months and had already proven herself invaluable, sat across from her in the carriage with a hat box balanced on her knees and an expression that hovered somewhere between focused and terrified. "We'll arrive before 8, Clara said, not because Evelyn had asked, but because silence made her nervous. "That gives us 40 minutes before the Ashford dinner begins in earnest." "I know. The guest list has Lady Pemberton on it, and Mrs. Whitmore, and Clara." "Yes, ma'am." "I know who'll be there." Clara pressed her lips together and adjusted the hat box. "Of course, I only thought—" "You thought I might want to reconsider." Evelyn finally looked away from the window. "I don't." Clara held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the way people nod when they've accepted something they still think is a mistake, but have run out of ways to argue against it. "Right, then we proceed. Then we proceed." The Ashford house on Grosvenor Square was lit up like a lantern, every window blazing, carriages 3 deep along the street, footmen in white gloves moving with that particular brand of rehearsed efficiency that old money bought and new money envied. Lady Ashford herself was not what anyone would call a warm woman, but she was powerful, and in London in 1864, an invitation to her dinner table was the closest thing to a social resurrection a fallen woman could reasonably hope for. Evelyn had not waited for an invitation. She'd engineered one. 3 weeks of careful correspondence, a well-placed note through a mutual acquaintance, a subtle reminder that the late Lord Hartwell, whatever else he was, had been a significant patron of Lady Ashford's charitable society, and that his widow had come into possession of certain items of correspondence that Lady Ashford might find valuable to have returned privately. It wasn't blackmail. Not exactly. It was simply the language of power, spoken by someone who had spent years learning how to speak it. The footman at the door took her card, looked at it, looked at her, and then, because he was trained not to let anything show, Hossa looked back at the card. There was the briefest of hesitations. She watched it happen, catalogued it. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, recovering. "Welcome." She entered the drawing room like she owned the square outside it. That was the thing they never understood about her, these people. They thought composure was a mask, something you put on when you were frightened to hide the fear underneath. But for Evelyn, it wasn't a mask. It had been built out of necessity, yes, but it had become something else entirely over the years. Genuine, structural, the kind of stillness you only develop when you've had everything stripped away and discovered, to your own faint surprise, that you are still standing. The room was full. 40, perhaps 50 guests, all of them draped in the finest fabrics that wealth and social ambition could produce. Crystal glasses catching candlelight, string quartet in the corner making civilized sound. The smell of hothouse flowers and French perfume, and the faintly metallic undertone of people who were, at their core, always slightly nervous about their own position and spent a great deal of energy pretending otherwise. Evelyn noticed everything, clocked the room in 3 seconds flat. The clusters, the alliances, the avoidances, the hunger. Who was talking to whom? Who was pointedly not talking to whom? Who had seen her come in and immediately turned away? And who had seen her and was now leaning toward their companion to whisper. She counted 6 whispers in the first 30 seconds. A personal record. "My God," said a voice at her elbow. "She actually came." Evelyn turned. Mrs. Dorothea Whitmore, 62 years old, the undisputed queen of London gossip, stood 4 feet away with a glass of champagne and an expression of undisguised fascination. She was a broad woman with small, bright eyes like chips of dark glass, and she had the particular talent of someone who has spent decades saying unkind things while maintaining the appearance of affection. "Mrs. Whitmore," Evelyn said pleasantly, "you look well." "I look exactly the same as I always do," Dorothea waved a hand dismissively. "Don't try to flatter me, child. I'm immune to it." She stepped closer, dropping her voice just enough to suggest intimacy without achieving it. "I heard you'd gone to the continent. France, was it? Or was it further? There were so many stories. There always are." Dorothea's eyes moved over her, assessing. "You've come back thin." "I've come back." "Yes." Something shifted in the older woman's face. Not quite respect, but the precursor to it. "So you have." She tapped her glass with one ringed finger, thinking. Then, "You know they'll tear you apart tonight." "I know." "And you came anyway." "I came anyway." Dorothea stared at her for a moment longer. Then she let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh. "Well, at least the evening won't be dull." She moved away, already scanning the room for her next audience, and Evelyn watched her go. One down. Lady Pemberton found her 20 minutes later, near the fireplace, and unlike Dorothea Whitmore, she didn't bother with pleasantries. Caroline Pemberton was 45, handsome in the manner of a woman who had once been beautiful and refused to stop being noticed. She'd been one of Margaret Hartwell's closest friends, Margaret being Evelyn's mother-in-law, a woman who had made the last 2 years of Evelyn's marriage into a particular kind of hell, and who had died, quite conveniently, some 6 months before her son. "You have nerve," Lady Pemberton said. No greeting, no pretense. "Good evening, Lady Pemberton." "Don't." The word came out sharp and flat, like a door slamming. "Don't do that. Don't stand there with that face and pretend this is a social call. We both know why you're here." Evelyn tilted her head just slightly. "Do we?" "You're here to reclaim something. Status, position. The Hartwell name." Lady Pemberton stepped closer, keeping her voice low enough that only Evelyn could hear her. But her expression was perfectly composed for the benefit of anyone watching. And people were watching. "That name belongs to the family. Whatever you think you're entitled to, I am entitled to what is legally and rightfully mine," Evelyn said, quietly. No heat, no tremor. "Which I will be pursuing through appropriate channels in due course. Tonight is simply dinner." "Tonight is a declaration of war, and you know it." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Then perhaps you should make sure your allies are better armed." Lady Pemberton's jaw tightened. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to recognition. The look of someone who has underestimated an opponent and is only now beginning to recalibrate. She turned and walked away without another word. Evelyn picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray and took a single, measured sip. 2 down. The dining room seated 32. Evelyn had been placed near the middle of the table, not near the head, which would have been a statement, but not near the foot either, which would have been an insult. Lady Ashford, to her credit, had managed to be precisely, calculatedly neutral, which told Evelyn that the woman had no intention of taking sides yet. Useful. She was seated between a quiet man named Mr. Calloway, who worked in railway investments and spent most of dinner studying his soup, and a young baronet named Sir Frederick Marsh, who was 24, recently inherited, already out of his depth, and desperately trying to appear otherwise. He spent the first two courses talking to the woman on his other side. Then, during the fish course, he turned to Evelyn with the careful casualness of someone who has been building up to something. "You're the Hartwell widow," he said. "I am. I've heard a great deal about you." He paused, clearly expecting some response to this. When none came, he continued, "I was sorry to hear about Lord Hartwell. Tragic, what happened." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Tragic. He was well regarded in certain circles." She looked at him. "Which circles?" The question seemed to unsettle him slightly. "Well, business, commerce, the club, I suppose." "He was regarded by people who didn't know him," Evelyn said pleasantly, returning her attention to her plate. "That was the general pattern." Sir Frederick blinked. Then, deciding this was not a conversation he was equipped to navigate, he pivoted to the safer topic of the railway expansion and didn't look at her again for the rest of the meal. The quiet man on her other side, Mr. Calloway, glanced up from his soup at that moment and caught her eye. Something in his expression was different from everyone else's. Not the cautious fascination she'd been getting all evening, not the guarded hostility, not the performative sympathy. Something more like amusement, small, contained, but there. "Railway investment," she said to him quietly. He looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "You work in railway investment. The Manchester line primarily, but you've been looking at the northern expansion routes." He set his spoon down slowly. "How did you—" "You've been reviewing the same set of figures in your head since the soup course. You keep glancing at your coat pocket, which means there are documents in it you'd rather be reading. And when Sir Frederick mentioned railway expansion just now, you got that specific look people get when someone stumbles onto the topic they actually care about." She paused. "Am I wrong?" Mr. Calloway stared at her for a moment. Then, "No, you're not wrong." He sounded almost cautious, the way people sound when they're not sure yet whether to be impressed or unsettled. "You're very observant, Mrs. Hartwell." "I've had to be." He nodded once, slowly. "The northern expansion is a significant opportunity. If the capital can be sourced—" "Capital can always be sourced. The question is terms." She picked up her wine. "I'd be interested in discussing it further, if you're open to it." There was a pause. Then, "I think I might be. Yes." After dinner, the women withdrew to the drawing room in the time-honored tradition of allowing the men to drink and say the things they didn't want women to hear, which were, in Evelyn's experience, rarely as interesting as advertised. She positioned herself near the tall windows that looked out onto the square. Outside, the rain had stopped. The gas lamps threw their usual amber smear over the wet cobblestones, and a cat was picking its way delicately along the garden wall across the road, seemingly indifferent to everything. She envied it, briefly. "You're not what I expected." The voice came from her left. She turned. The woman standing there was perhaps her own age, early 30s, with dark red hair and an expression of frank, appraising intelligence that was either entirely natural or had taken years to cultivate. She was wearing green, which nobody in this room was wearing, and she had the bearing of someone who didn't particularly care. "And what did you expect?" Evelyn asked. "Something more, damaged. Everyone talks about you as though you're a cautionary tale." The woman extended a gloved hand. "I'm Helena Voss. My husband was acquainted with yours." "Yes." Evelyn shook it. "I remember the name." "Then you know my husband wasn't a particularly good man either." Helena said it with remarkable composure, the way you state a fact you've processed so thoroughly it no longer has any power to wound you. "We have that in common, at least." Evelyn looked at her properly. There was something, direct and undeceived and very slightly reckless, about Helena Voss that she found, unexpectedly, that she liked. "What do you want?" Evelyn asked. Not unkindly, but directly, because directness was something she had decided years ago to offer to people who seemed capable of handling it. Helena smiled. It was quick and genuine and nothing like the smiles that had been pointed at Evelyn all evening. To tell you something that might be useful. She stepped closer, dropping her voice. Sir Edmund Reeve is here tonight. Did you notice? Evelyn had noticed. Sir Edmund Reeve, late Lord Hartwell's cousin, the man who stood to inherit the Hartwell estate if Evelyn failed to stabilize it, the man whose solicitors had been sending increasingly threatening correspondence to her for the past 6 months, each letter more confident than the last, each one radiating the particular satisfaction of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. I noticed, she said, he's been speaking to 3 separate men since dinner began. One is a solicitor, one works for the London Gazette. One I don't recognize, but he has the look of someone hired to find things out. Helena held her gaze steadily. Whatever you're planning, Mrs. Hartwell, I'd suggest you understand that he's not waiting. Neither am I. Helena studied her for a moment. Then she nodded, the same decisive nod Clara had given her in the carriage. The nod of someone who has reached a conclusion they're prepared to act on. Good. Then perhaps we could have tea this week. There are things worth discussing. Thursday, Evelyn said. Thursday. Sir Edmund found her before the evening was over. She'd expected that. She'd been tracking him all night through the social geometry of the room. The angle of his body when he was talking, the direction of his glances, the way he moved toward her in slow, confident increments, like a man who was used to being able to take his time with things. He was 58 years old, with the kind of broad, settled weight of a man who had never once in his life seriously worried about money. He had kind eyes, which was the most dangerous thing about him because they weren't kind at all. They were simply patient. There was a difference. Evelyn, he said, and the use of her first name was deliberate, designed to set a certain tone. Sir Edmund, she kept her voice level and her expression mild. I had heard you'd returned. He stood beside her, looking out at the room, maintaining the companionable pose of a social conversation. I confess I was surprised, given everything. Given what, specifically? He smiled. The smile of a man who believes he holds all the cards and wants you to know it without actually saying so. The estate is in significant difficulty. The debts that George left behind, well, you know the figures. I do. Then you know the timeline. 7 months, she said, before the estate transfers. 6 months and 3 weeks, as of today. He turned to look at her, and there it was. The patience sitting behind the kindness like water behind a dam. I want you to know, Evelyn, that I have no personal animosity toward you, none whatsoever. What happened between you and George was, well, it was between you and George. My only concern is the estate, the Hartwell name, the legacy. She looked at him. You mean your inheritance? Something shifted in the patient eyes. Not anger. He was too controlled for that, but a slight recalibration. The look of someone who has revised their assessment of the obstacle in front of them. I mean the responsible management of something that has been in this family for... It is my estate, Sir Edmund. She kept her voice perfectly pleasant. For 6 months and 3 weeks, at minimum, and I intend to use every day of it. He studied her for a moment, then, you were always stubborn. I prefer thorough. He excused himself shortly after, which was what she had intended. Getting him to leave the conversation first on her terms was a small thing, but small things had their own value. They were the building blocks of larger ones. It was past 11 when the carriages began to form outside. Evelyn collected her wrap from a footman and stood in the entrance hall waiting for Clara, watching the other guests filter out in pairs and groups, their conversations dropping to murmurs as they passed her. She caught the fragments they didn't bother to hide. Remarkable nerve showing up here. George would be appalled. Can't possibly survive the season. The estate is ruined. Someone should warn Ashford about inviting her. The association alone. She stood completely still and let the words wash past her. She'd learned in the years since George that words only had the power you gave them, and she had made a decision, somewhere in a cold room in Bath during the second winter of her exile, to give them nothing. Not one single thing. Clara appeared at her elbow with her coat. The carriage is ready. Good. They moved toward the door. A man was coming in the opposite direction, entering as others were leaving, which was unusual enough that she noticed him before she saw his face. He was tall, perhaps 6'1", wearing a dark coat with no particular decoration, and he moved through the crowd with the unconscious certainty of someone who has never once questioned his right to occupy whatever space he chooses to occupy. She recognized him a half-second before he looked at her. Adrian Vale, the Duke of Ashmore. She'd seen him once before, 4 years ago, at a different function, a lifetime ago. He'd been pointed out to her, not because he was conspicuous, but because he was conspicuously self-contained in a room full of people performing for each other. She remembered thinking that he looked like a man who was tired of almost everything. He still looked like that. Their eyes met in the entrance hall, briefly, the way eyes meet in a crowded place. A second, less, and then he was past her, and she was out the door and into the cold night air, and Clara was asking if she wanted the lap rug in the carriage. Yes, she said. She didn't look back. Hartwell House was dark when they arrived. She'd expected that too. The skeleton staff she'd arranged, a housekeeper, 2 maids, a cook, who had agreed to come out of what appeared to be sheer curiosity about the situation, had left one lamp burning in the entrance hall, and it cast just enough light to show her what she already knew. The house had been neglected, not destroyed, not ransacked, just left. The way things are left when there's no money to maintain them and everyone with an interest in the outcome is waiting to see which way the wind blows. She walked through the entrance hall slowly. Her boots on the marble floor made a sound that echoed. There were dust sheets over most of the furniture in the drawing room she could see through the half-open door, and the windows needed cleaning, and there was a smell. Not quite damp, but the suggestion of it. The beginning of things falling apart. She stood in the middle of the hall and looked up at the staircase. George had died at the bottom of that staircase. She looked at the spot where it had happened, the 3rd step from the bottom, where the balustrade curved. She looked at it the way you look at something that used to be enormous in your mind and has shrunk in the keeping. Not small exactly, but reduced. Put in proportion by everything that had happened since. Mrs. Hartwell. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Gaines, appearing from the direction of the kitchen with the look of a woman who runs a tight household regardless of circumstances. I've had your rooms prepared. There's tea if you want it. Thank you, Mrs. Gaines. Evelyn looked at her. You stayed. Mrs. Gaines straightened slightly. Someone had to. That was all. No sentiment, no grand statement, just someone had to. Evelyn found she appreciated that more than anything else that had been said to her all evening. The accounts, she said. What's the state of the household ledger, Mrs. Gaines's expression told her before the words did. Not good, ma'am. No, I didn't think so. She began to remove her gloves, 1 finger at a time. Bring them to me in the morning, early, 7 o'clock. Yes, ma'am. And Mrs. Gaines? She paused. Thank you for keeping things together. The housekeeper gave a short nod. Then she withdrew, and Evelyn was alone in the entrance hall with the single lamp and the dust and the echo of her own footsteps. She stood there for a moment, very still. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the dark London street, at the gas lamps, at the night. The Hartwell estate was drowning. She had 6 months and 3 weeks. She had no husband, no family willing to help, and no allies yet. Helena Voss being the possible beginning of something, and Mr. Calloway with his railway documents a thread worth pulling, but nothing solid yet. Nothing she could stand on. She had her mind, her memory, the particular kind of tenacity that comes not from courage, but from having already been through worse and discovered you don't break as easily as everyone thinks you do. And she had this house. For now, she pressed one hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Outside, London went on doing what it always did. Indifferent, relentless, entirely unimpressed. Fine, she thought, be that way. She turned away from the window and went to find the tea. She didn't sleep much. She rarely did in new places, and Hartwell House wasn't exactly a new place. It was an old place she'd spent years trying to leave, which was somehow worse. She lay in the bed that Mrs. Gaines had prepared with clean linen and a hot water bottle, and she stared at the ceiling and let her mind do what it always did in the dark: catalog, plan, anticipate. The accounts in the morning. Then correspondence. She had 3 letters that needed writing, and none of them were simple. She needed to contact her solicitor, a man named Baxter, whom she'd been using for 2 years, and who had a quality she'd come to value above all others in legal counsel, which was that he thought she was capable of understanding things. Not all lawyers did. She needed to follow up on the railway matter. Mr. Calloway had given her his card, slipped it across the table during the dessert course with the practiced discretion of a man who'd learned to be careful about who he did business with, which suggested he was better at his work than people gave him credit for. And she needed to find out more about the man Sir Edmund had brought to the dinner. The one Helena Voss didn't recognize. The one who had the look of someone hired to find things out. That was the one that kept her awake. She knew, with a clarity that had become a kind of sixth sense over the years, that whatever Sir Edmund knew, or suspected, or was in the process of discovering, it was only a matter of time before the question of George's death became something more than a family story, more than a whispered piece of social gossip. Something with teeth. She'd known this day would come. She'd prepared for it, as much as you can prepare for the thing you are most afraid of. But preparation and readiness were not the same thing, and alone in the dark of a house that had never been kind to her, Evelyn Hartwell was, if she was completely honest with herself, closer to afraid than she had been in a long time. Not paralyzed, not beaten, but afraid. She acknowledged it, sat with it for a moment, let it be what it was. Then she turned over, adjusted the pillow, and went back to planning. The morning came in cold and gray, the way London mornings usually did, with a light that didn't so much illuminate things as simply make them visible. By the time Mrs. Gaines arrived with the ledgers at 7 o'clock, Evelyn was already at the desk in the study, dressed and alert, with a pot of tea at her elbow that was already half empty. She had known the figures wouldn't be good. But there was something different about knowing a thing in the abstract and then seeing it laid out in a ledger in plain ink, the specific numbers, the specific debts, the specific names of the specific men who were owed money and who were becoming, with each passing week, less patient about it. She went through it page by page. Mrs. Gaines sat across from her in a straight-backed chair, silent, occasionally pointing to a figure or a notation when Evelyn paused. The total outstanding debt was just under £14,000. Against that, a house that needed significant repair, a fraction of land that might be sold but would not fetch the price it should in the current market, and whatever Evelyn could generate herself within the next 6 months and 3 weeks. She closed the ledger. How much staff is strictly necessary to maintain the house at a basic level? She asked. Mrs. Gaines considered this carefully, which Evelyn appreciated. She didn't inflate or minimize. She thought about it. 3, perhaps 4, including myself. And you're willing to stay? I am. I can't guarantee full wages until the situation improves. I can guarantee partial, with the balance paid when, if circumstances allow. Mrs. Gaines met her eyes. There was something there, not pity, which Evelyn would have found intolerable, but something quieter, an assessment, the look of someone deciding whether to trust. That'll do, ma'am. Evelyn nodded. Good. Reduce the household to the minimum. Anyone who goes will receive a full reference and 2 months additional pay from my personal funds. She paused. I know the coffers are thin. I'm aware of what I'm promising. I'll make it good. I believe you, Mrs. Gaines said, with a simplicity that closed the subject. The letter from Sir Edmund's solicitor arrived on the 3rd day. She'd been expecting it, but the speed of it still surprised her slightly. He wasn't wasting time. Good. She preferred an enemy who moved openly to one who worked only in shadows. At least with the former, you could see the shape of what was coming. The letter was 3 pages. Formal, correct, bristling with legal language that was designed to appear reasonable while doing the work of a threat. It outlined the terms of the estate entailment. It detailed the timeline. It made certain suggestions about what a sensible arrangement might look like. Suggestions that amounted, at their core, to this. Accept that you've already lost, sign what we put in front of you, and we'll let you leave quietly. She read it twice, calmly. Then she set it on the desk beside the ledger, weighted it down with a small brass paperweight, and wrote her response. It was 1 page. Clear, precise, legally grounded. She had done her work on this over months in Bath and Bristol, in borrowed libraries and through Baxter's patient correspondence. She laid out in plain language the counter-argument, the areas where Sir Edmund's claim was less airtight than his solicitors believed, the timeline she disputed, the fact that she had not, in any way, accepted the outcome they were assuming. She sealed it and sent it before noon. That evening, she wrote to Mr. Calloway. His response came 2 days later, which was faster than she'd expected and suggested he'd been thinking about their conversation at dinner more than casual professional interest would require. The letter was careful, professional, and contained between its lines. If you knew how to read the space between what was written and what was meant, the distinct possibility of genuine opportunity. They arranged to meet at a tea room in Kensington, neutral ground, which was his suggestion and which she found appropriate. He came alone, which she noted. He arrived first, which she also noted. He was not what she'd expected in the full daylight of a proper meeting. At dinner, he'd been subdued, internal. Here he was direct, precise, and had clearly done his homework. He'd found out about her. Not the gossip version, but the substance. Her background before her marriage. Her education, which had been unconventional, and which her father, in a moment of either foresight or sheer stubbornness, had insisted upon. Her understanding of numbers. You know, the northern expansion has been dismissed by most of the established investment houses, he said, cutting immediately to the point, which she appreciated. I know. They've been looking at the short-term capital requirements and concluding it's too risky. They're applying the wrong model. He paused. Something sharpened in his expression. Go on. She explained it carefully, but without condescending to explain more than was necessary. The northern expansion, unlike the southern lines that had already been built out, was going to hit a period of sustained growth in approximately 18 months, when the industrial output of 3 specific mill towns increased to the point where the existing transport infrastructure couldn't handle the volume. It was a matter of timing, not risk tolerance. The risk was real, yes, but it was a known risk, calculable, with a definable endpoint. Calloway listened. He had the rare quality of listening like he actually intended to retain what you said, rather than simply waiting for his own turn to speak. You've modeled this, he said, when she finished. I have. I'd want to see the figures. I can arrange that. There was a pause. He looked at her with the same complex expression he'd had at dinner. Not quite settled, not quite unsettled. The look of someone who has arrived at a situation they didn't anticipate and is reassessing. You're proposing a joint venture, he said. You provide capital analysis and strategic positioning. I provide the primary investment and the connections. And we split the returns proportionately. Your capital exposure would be, significant, I know. She held his gaze. I'm aware of what I'm putting on the table. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why not simply find a husband who can solve this more simply? It was said without cruelty, clinically, almost, the way you might ask any logical question. She looked at him steadily and said, with equal calm, because I'm not interested in a solution that requires me to disappear into someone else's name again. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence before. Something in it had shifted. Fair enough, he said finally, and then, show me the figures, Matt. She showed him the figures 3 days later, in a borrowed office in the city, laid out across a desk that was slightly too big for the room. He spent an hour with them. She sat across from him and drank tea and waited, and did not say anything. At the end of the hour, he looked up. This is good work, he said. Not with surprise exactly, but with the particular weight of a man revising an assessment downward, in the right direction. Thank you. It doesn't solve your timeline. Not alone. No. You need a second position, something with faster returns in the near term, while this one develops. He tapped the figures. The northern expansion buys you the long term. You need something for the short term that isn't the railway. She had been thinking the same thing. She didn't say so immediately, because sometimes the more useful move was to let someone else be right out loud. It built trust. What are you thinking? He was already reaching for a different set of papers from the portfolio he'd brought. And in the borrowed office in the city, with rain beginning again outside and the sounds of London traffic filtering through the window, Evelyn Hartwell and Thomas Calloway began to build something. She didn't know yet if it would be enough. She didn't know yet how much Sir Edmund had found out, or how quickly he intended to move, or what the man with the careful eyes at the Ashford dinner had uncovered and carried back to his employer. She knew that 6 months and 3 weeks had become 6 months and 10 days. She knew that every day mattered, and she knew, with the same cold, structural certainty she'd developed over years of surviving things she was not supposed to survive, that she was not done yet. Not by a long way. The figures didn't lie. That was the problem with figures. They never did. They sat on the page with the particular indifference of mathematics, unmoved by circumstance or ambition or the number of sleepless hours that had gone into producing them, and they said what they said. Evelyn stared at the column she'd been working on for the better part of 2 hours and accepted, with the clean precision of someone who has long since learned the difference between what she wanted to be true and what actually was, that the short-term position Thomas Calloway had sketched out in the borrowed city office was going to need significant restructuring before it was viable. The numbers worked in theory. In practice, 3 of the underlying assumptions were wrong. She crossed out a line, rewrote it, crossed it out again. The study at Hartwell House had become, over the course of 10 days, something between a war room and a salvage operation. Papers covered the desk in layers. Estate accounts, railway projections, legal correspondence, the meticulous notes she made in the margins of everything she read, small and precise. The handwriting of someone who had taught herself to compress thought into small spaces because space, for most of her life, had been in limited supply. The fire had burned low. She hadn't noticed. Clara appeared in the doorway holding a candlestick and wearing the expression of someone who has been dispatched against their better judgment. Mrs. Gaines says it's past midnight. Mrs. Gaines is correct. She also says you haven't eaten since this afternoon. I'll eat in the morning. She anticipated that response. Clara crossed the room and set a small plate on the corner of the desk that wasn't covered in paper. Bread and butter and a slice of cold chicken, assembled with the quiet competence that Mrs. Gaines brought to everything. She also anticipated that you'd ignore me. She asked me to tell you that a woman who collapses from hunger helps no one, including herself. Evelyn looked at the plate. Then she picked up the bread, took a bite, and went back to the figures. Clara waited. You can go, Evelyn said. I'm aware. Clara didn't move. There's a letter came this evening, from a Mr. Fenwick. I left it on the side table by the door. I thought you'd seen it, but apparently not. Evelyn looked up. She didn't know a Mr. Fenwick. She read the letter twice before she recognized what it was. It was written in careful, neutral language, the language of a professional doing a job, and it requested, in the most courteous of terms, a meeting at her earliest convenience to discuss matters pertaining to the late Lord Hartwell's estate. It provided no details. It named no employer. It offered a time and a place and a signature. R. Fenwick, Investigations. She set the letter down on the desk and sat very still for a moment, the way you sit when you need to think clearly and the thing you're thinking about has the capacity to unhinge you if you allow it to. Fenwick. She pulled the name against everything she knew and came up with nothing, which told her he was either new or careful, or both. Helena Voss had warned her. He has the look of someone hired to find things out. She'd been watching for it, the oblique inquiry, the careful question, the sudden interest from someone with no obvious reason to be interested. She'd been watching for it and planning for it, and still, looking at this letter at midnight with cold chicken and railway projections spread across the desk. She felt the ground shift slightly beneath everything she'd been building. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer, locked it. Then she finished the bread and went back to the figures because the figures still needed fixing, and panic, as she had learned at considerable personal cost, was only useful if it was pointed in a productive direction. The morning brought rain again, and with it, Thomas Calloway, who arrived at 9 o'clock with a revised set of projections and the slightly harassed look of a man who had been doing his own midnight arithmetic. They worked through the numbers at the dining room table, the study having been commandeered by its own chaos, and within an hour had established that 2 of the 3 flawed assumptions were fixable and one was not. The unfixable one concerned a piece of land adjacent to the northern expansion route that they had been counting on as a secondary security position, and which, it turned out, was already under option to a development consortium who had been much faster off the mark than either of them had anticipated. Calloway dropped his pen. That changes the security structure entirely. Yes. He rubbed a hand over his face. We need a replacement position. I know. Something we can move on quickly. He drummed his fingers on the table in a quick, distracted rhythm. There's a textile mill in Derbyshire that came to my attention last month. I didn't pursue it. The risk profile seemed too variable. But if we're looking for short-term returns with a compressed timeline, show me. He had the figures on him because Calloway, she was learning, was the kind of man who carried everything on him in case it became relevant. He spread the papers out, and she went through them quickly, running the calculations in her head first, then verifying with the pen. The mill was viable. Barely. The margins were tighter than she'd like, and the operational assumptions required a degree of trust in the current management that she would need to verify independently. But it was viable. It works, she said, if the management holds up under scrutiny. And if it doesn't, then we don't do it. She looked at him. I need you to find out everything you can about the management structure, quietly. Who runs it? Who funds it currently? Whether there's anything in the books that's been moved around to look better than it is. Calloway raised an eyebrow. You think it's been dressed up? I think everything worth looking at closely has been dressed up in some way. I'd rather know before we're in than after. He nodded, making a note. Then, after a moment, You're very good at this. She glanced up. At what? At not trusting anything on its face. He didn't say it as a compliment exactly, more as an observation, the kind that comes from recognition rather than admiration. Most people either trust everything or trust nothing. You do something else. I verify, she said. It's not complicated. It's rarer than you think. She didn't answer that because answering it would have required explaining where it came from, and that was not a conversation she intended to have over a textile mill projection on a rainy Tuesday morning. She turned back to the papers. I'll need the management report by Thursday. Can you manage that? I'll manage it. Thursday also brought Helena Voss, as arranged, punctually at 2:00, in a hired carriage and a dark blue dress that suggested she'd come straight from somewhere important without quite saying so. She settled into the chair across from Evelyn in the drawing room, still mostly under dust sheets, but Evelyn had uncovered 2 chairs and a side table, which was enough, and accepted tea without ceremony. You've been busy, Helena said, looking around at the state of the house with the frank, appraising look she applied to everything. The place looks like someone actually means to stay in it. I do mean to stay in it. Good. Helena wrapped both hands around her teacup. Then you should know that Sir Edmund has retained a second solicitor, a man named Partridge, who specializes in contested inheritance cases. He does very well, apparently. Evelyn absorbed this. When? Last week. Helena looked at her steadily. He's moving faster than you thought. He's moving at the speed I thought, Evelyn said, which was true. She'd estimated the timeline. She'd simply been hoping she was wrong. And the other man? The one from the dinner? Fenwick, Helena said. Robert Fenwick. He's been retained privately, not through the solicitors, which means whatever he's looking for, Sir Edmund doesn't want the legal channel to see it yet. So the letter had been genuine, not an opening move in a legal proceeding. Something more exploratory than that. Something designed to find out how much Evelyn knew before anything was committed to an official record. He contacted me, she said. Helena set down her cup. Fenwick contacted you directly? A letter. He wants a meeting. There was a pause. What do you plan to do? Evelyn had been thinking about this since midnight on Monday. She'd turned it over and over, testing every angle, looking for the trap in each possible response. Refusing the meeting was an option, but it told Fenwick she had something to protect, which was information she didn't want to give him. Meeting with him unprepared was worse. Meeting with him fully prepared, controlling the terms. I'm going to meet him, she said. Helena blinked. It was a small reaction, barely perceptible, but on Helena's normally composed face it was equivalent to a sharp intake of breath. That's either very brave or very reckless. It might be both, but if I know what he's found, I know what I'm dealing with, and right now I'm dealing with a shadow. She looked at Helena directly. I'd rather face the thing than fight what I think the thing might be. Helena was quiet for a moment, then, "You'll need to know everything before you walk into that room. Every detail. Whatever he knows, you need to know it first, or better." "Yes. I might be able to help with that." Helena said it in the tone of someone who has been waiting to say it. "I have certain connections. People who are good at finding things out about the people who find things out. If you want to know what Fenwick knows before you sit down with him." Evelyn looked at her. "Why are you helping me?" It was a direct question, and she knew it. And she asked it anyway because directness had served her better than politeness, and because she genuinely wanted to know. Helena Voss had nothing obvious to gain from involving herself in Evelyn's particular storm. Helena turned the teacup in her hands. Something moved across her face. Not discomfort exactly, more like the expression of someone deciding how much truth to put into an answer. "Because I was you," she said finally. 6 years ago. Different circumstances, different name, same basic problem. A dead husband, a hostile family, and a system designed to ensure that people like us lose. She met Evelyn's eyes. "Someone helped me. Not entirely for selfless reasons, and not without complication, but they helped. I managed to keep what was mine." She paused. "I'm not sentimental about it, but I'm not ungrateful either." Evelyn held her gaze for a moment. There was something in that admission, its plainness, the absence of drama, that she found more trustworthy than any elegant speech would have been. "Thursday week," she said. "I'll have Fenwick's letter answered by then. Can your connections work that quickly?" "They can work faster if needed." "Thursday week is sufficient." Evelyn picked up her tea. "And Helena?" "Thank you." Helena almost smiled. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're still standing in 6 months." The meeting with Fenwick happened on a Wednesday, 10 days after his letter arrived, at a coffee house in Holborn that was neutral enough to be appropriate and public enough to prevent anything overtly threatening. Helena's connections had been efficient. Evelyn walked into that coffee house knowing more about Robert Fenwick than he almost certainly expected. 41 years old, former constable, left the service under circumstances that were officially recorded as voluntary retirement, and were, in fact, somewhat more complicated than that. Worked independently for the last 7 years, with a client list that skewed heavily toward families contesting wills, estates, and the various legal tangle points that arose when money and death intersected. He was thorough. He was not cruel. He had a reputation for finding things and presenting them, without particular judgment, to whoever had employed him to find them. That last part was what she had to work with. He was already seated when she arrived, with coffee and a brown folder on the table in front of him, and the contained, watchful quality of a man who was very good at being underestimated. He was unremarkable looking in the way that people are sometimes deliberately unremarkable. Medium height, medium build, clothes that were correct without being notable. The kind of man you'd pass on the street 3 times and not remember. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, standing briefly as she took the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Fenwick." She settled herself and signaled for coffee. "I'll be direct if you don't mind. I find it saves time." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Recalibration again. She seemed to be prompting a great deal of that lately. "Of course. You've been retained to investigate the circumstances of Lord Hartwell's death. You're looking specifically for evidence that his fall was not accidental." She held his gaze as she said it, watching his face, and what she saw there was not the surprise she would have seen if she'd been wrong. "What have you found?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "You're well informed," he said. "I try to be." He looked at her for a moment with the particular look of a professional reassessing the terms of an engagement. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want to be clear that my role is investigative, not adversarial. Your role is whatever Sir Edmund Reeve is paying you to make it," she said, without edge but without softness either. "And Sir Edmund is paying you to find something that will hold up under legal scrutiny. So let's not spend each other's time on the polite version." She paused. What have you found? Another pause. Then Fenwick opened the brown folder. He had interviewed 4 people, a former footman named Dobbs, who had left the Hartwell household 3 months before George's death and harbored apparently considerable resentment about the circumstances of his departure, a woman who had worked briefly as a seamstress for the household and had, according to Dobbs, witnessed what she described as a disturbance on the night in question, a physician named Dr. Hale, who had attended the scene and whose original report noted certain aspects of the fall that had been, in his words at the time, somewhat inconsistent with a straightforward accident, and a neighbor who had heard raised voices from the direction of the Hartwell house on the evening George died. She listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, she picked up her coffee cup and took a sip that she did not particularly need or want, because the act of doing it gave her 2 seconds to arrange what was happening in her chest into something that didn't show on her face. The seamstress. She hadn't known about the seamstress. She had thought, she had been so certain that there had been no one else. The seamstress, she said steadily. Does she have a name? A Mrs. Parr. She's living in Whitechapel now. Evelyn set down the cup. And what is she prepared to say specifically? Fenwick looked at her with the careful, neutral expression of a man who was watching something more complicated than he'd bargained for unfold in front of him and hadn't decided yet what to do about it. She says she saw you on the landing, shortly before the fall. The fire in the coffee house was warm. The room was busy with the usual midday noise, conversation, the clatter of cups, a burst of laughter from somewhere near the front. Perfectly ordinary. The world going about its business, indifferent and relentless. Mr. Fenwick, Evelyn said, what do you believe happened that night? He went very still. That's not my, I know it's not your place to believe anything. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him directly. You've been doing this work for 7 years. You've seen cases like this before, I imagine. Cases where the circumstances of a death were irregular. What does your instinct tell you about this one? The question was a risk. She knew it as she asked it, but Helena had said he was not cruel, and she had read him across the table for the last 15 minutes, and she thought she believed, that he was the kind of man who still, somewhere beneath the professional neutrality, had a functional conscience. He was quiet for a long moment. My instinct, he said slowly, tells me that the people who commissioned this investigation are less interested in the truth than in a version of events that serves a specific legal purpose. Yes, she said. That's right. And my instinct also tells me that whatever happened in that house, it was not a simple accident, and it was also not what Sir Edmund Reeve is hoping it was. He looked at her steadily. He wants a murder, clean and clear and prosecutable. I don't think that's what I'm looking at. No, she said. It's not. The silence between them was different now, still careful but with a different texture, the texture of 2 people who have moved past the polite version into something closer to the actual conversation. I have obligations to my client, Fenwick said. I know. I can't simply... I'm not asking you to suppress anything. Her voice was level. I'm asking you to be accurate. What you have is a former footman with a grievance, a neighbor who heard noise, a physician's note that raises questions without answering them, and a seamstress who saw a woman on a landing. She paused. That is not evidence of murder, and you know it. He looked at her for a long, considering moment. What it is, he said carefully, is enough to cause a great deal of difficulty for a woman who is already in a precarious position. Yes, she agreed. That's the point of it. She told Helena about the seamstress that evening at Helena's house on Belgrave Street, where they sat in the upstairs sitting room with the door closed and the fire high, because Helena had said, when she saw Evelyn's face, that whatever was coming next, she wanted walls around it. Helena listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Evelyn had come, in a short time, to rely on. When she finished, there was a silence, and then Helena said, "Can you find her? Before they prepare her statement for the solicitors?" "I need to find her first, but yes." Evelyn's hands were in her lap, still. She'd been sitting very still since leaving the coffee house in Holborn, because stillness was the thing she had to hold on to when everything else wanted to move in too many directions at once. The question is what she actually saw and what she thinks she saw. They're not always the same thing. And if what she saw is closer to what happened than you'd like, Evelyn looked at the fire for a moment. Then I need to know that too. Helena leaned forward slightly. Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me because I can't help you with something I don't understand. She waited until Evelyn looked at her. What actually happened that night? The fire popped. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking with the patient metronomic indifference of all clocks everywhere. Evelyn was quiet for long enough that Helena began to think she wasn't going to answer. Then she said very quietly, not a performance, not a calculated response, just the flat and terrible plainness of something that had been carried for 3 years. He was hurting me. He had been hurting me for a long time. That night was worse than usual. I had nowhere to go and nothing left in me that was willing to simply absorb it anymore. She paused. I pushed him. It was a single motion. I hadn't planned it. I didn't know. She stopped, started again. The stairs were right there. He lost his balance. I didn't know he would fall that badly. I didn't know he would. Another pause. When I understood what had happened, I understood what it would mean if anyone found out. The law, the family, all of it. A woman who killed her husband, regardless of why. Helena was very still. Dr. Hale was sympathetic, Evelyn continued. He had seen the bruises before. He knew enough. He agreed to write what he wrote. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. Her voice didn't break, but it was close to something. Not the edge of grief, but the edge of a very old and very specific exhaustion. So, that's what happened. The silence afterward was the kind that settles over a room when something true has been said in it, something that couldn't be unsaid and didn't need to be. Helena sat with it for a moment. Then, you did what you had to do. Yes. And you've been running from it ever since. Yes. Evelyn met her eyes. Until now, B.T. The railway documents arrived from Callaway on a Friday. The textile mill management report came the following Monday. Both were better than expected. The mill in particular had come back cleaner than either of them had anticipated. Its current management sound, if unimaginative, its books in genuine order. The margins were still tight, but it was workable. She met with Callaway again on Tuesday to finalize the structure, this time in her own study at Hartwell House, which had been partially reclaimed from its paper chaos. He sat across from her desk with his coat still on because the room was cold. She'd been holding the coal ration to minimum, and they went through the terms with the focused brevity of two people who had established enough mutual trust to stop qualifying everything. When it was done, Callaway sat back. We should talk about the timeline. The first returns from the northern expansion won't begin to materialize for another 14 months at minimum. Even with the mill position in place, you're looking at a gap. I know. A gap that Sir Edmund's solicitors are almost certainly aware of. I know that too. He turned the pen in his fingers. Is there anything else you can liquidate? Assets that aren't tied to the estate proper? Evelyn opened the desk drawer and produced a velvet pouch. She set it on the desk between them without dramatics. Inside, 3 pieces of jewelry. A diamond brooch, a set of earrings, and a bracelet that had belonged to her mother. She'd brought them from Bath wrapped in a stocking and hadn't looked at them in weeks. Callaway looked at the pouch, then at her. They're mine, she said. Not estate property. They'll cover approximately 4 months of basic operating costs. Evelyn, they're jewelry, she said flatly. I don't need jewelry. I need 6 months. He said nothing for a moment. Then he pushed the pouch back across the desk toward her. Keep them as a last resort. We may not need them if the mill comes in at the upper end of the projection. And if it doesn't, then we use them. He met her gaze. Not yet. She put the pouch back in the drawer. There was something slightly humiliating about the gesture. The whole transaction, the careful economics of survival being negotiated in a cold study over a handful of inherited diamonds. And she was aware of it, and she allowed herself to be aware of it for exactly the length of time it took to close the drawer, and then she let it go. "There's something else," she said. She told him about Fenwick. Not all of it. Not the part she'd told Helena. Not the substance of what had actually happened. Just the structure of the threat. An investigator, a set of witnesses, a legal machinery beginning to assemble itself around a version of events designed to take from her the last remaining thing she had left to protect. Calloway listened with his pen still in his hand and his expression doing the careful work of not reacting faster than the information warranted. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How solid is what they have?" "Fragile," she said, "but fragile things can be made to look solid with the right framing." "And Fenwick himself?" "Is a professional with a conscience that isn't entirely decorative." She paused. "I don't think he wants to be used for this, but I don't know that his preferences are relevant to what Sir Edmund ultimately does with the information." Calloway turned the pen again. "You need a legal defense prepared." "I need a great deal of things prepared." He looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The way he had in the coffee room in Kensington on their first meeting, that same quality of reassessment. "You're managing a great many things at once." "Yes. How are you doing?" The question caught her slightly off guard, not because it was unexpected in itself, but because of the way he said it, plainly, without the social lubricant of a softening tone, the same directness he'd applied to every financial question they'd discussed, like it was simply another thing worth knowing. "I'm managing," she said. "That's not what I asked." She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." She picked up her pen. "Let's talk about the mill timeline." The letter arrived on a Thursday evening. It was not from Fenwick, and it was not from Sir Edmund's solicitors. It was from Adrian Vale. She knew the name. Everyone in London knew the name. The Duke of Ashmore was the kind of man whose name preceded him into rooms, not because he cultivated it, but because his combination of position, wealth, and the particular reputation he carried made it difficult to avoid. She'd registered him at the Ashford dinner the way she registered most things that evening. Filed, noted, moved on. He'd noted her too, apparently. The letter was brief, correct in every formal particular. It expressed, with the careful restraint of a man who understands how letters can be used against their authors, a wish to call upon her at her convenience, regarding a matter of potential mutual interest involving certain railway ventures he had been following with considerable attention. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk beside the current ledger and the pile of correspondence from Baxter and the notes she'd made from the textile mill report, and she looked at it for a moment. Railway ventures. She didn't believe that was the primary reason. She wasn't sure what the primary reason was, but she was certain, the way she was certain of most things that moved below the surface of stated intentions, that it wasn't simply railway ventures. She was also certain that a duke with significant influence and a demonstrated interest in her affairs, at this particular moment in her particular situation, was either the most dangerous development that had happened since she returned to London, or the most useful one. The problem was that she couldn't yet tell which. She picked up her pen and began to draft a response that was, like his letter, brief and correct in every formal particular, and which committed her to absolutely nothing except a willingness to receive visitors at an appropriate time. She wrote it carefully, choosing each word with the precision she applied to figures, testing the weight of it before committing it to the page. She was on the second draft when Clara knocked and entered, holding a small card. "There's a delivery, ma'am, just arrived. No name, only a note." Evelyn took the card. On it, in handwriting she didn't recognize, "Mrs. Parr is no longer in Whitechapel. She has been moved. If you want to find her before they prepare her, you have perhaps 4 days." No signature. She held the card for a moment. Her chest was doing something she chose not to name. 4 days. She looked at the draft letter to Adrian Vale on the desk. She looked at the card in her hand. She looked at the ledger and the railway projections and the velvet pouch in the drawer that held her mother's jewelry. 4 days. She put the draft letter aside, pulled a fresh sheet toward her, and began to write something else entirely. The fresh sheet of paper stayed blank for nearly a full minute. Evelyn sat with the pen in her hand and the unsigned card on the desk beside it, and did the thing she always did when the ground shifted unexpectedly. She went very still and let her mind catch up to what her instincts had already clocked. Someone had sent her this card. Someone who knew about Fenwick, knew about Mrs. Parr, knew that the woman had been moved and that moving her had a purpose. The information was specific enough to be useful and vague enough to be deniable, which meant whoever had written it understood exactly what they were doing. That narrowed it considerably. Not Helena. Helena would have sent it under her own name or come in person. Not Calloway. Too careful, and the handwriting had a precision to it that wasn't his. Fenwick himself was a possibility. She turned it over, a professional with a functional conscience who had already in their meeting signaled discomfort with the nature of his commission. If he'd decided to operate on two tracks at once, reporting to Sir Edmund while quietly alerting Evelyn, it was the kind of calculated double position that a man in his particular trade might find both practical and, in some small way, bearable to live with. She wrote 3 words at the top of the fresh sheet: "Find Mrs. Parr." Then she put the pen down, folded the card into her inner pocket, and went to wake Clara. Clara received the instruction with the expression she always wore when Evelyn did something that couldn't be argued with and also probably shouldn't be done, a kind of compressed, stoic resignation that was becoming the defining feature of her face. "Whitechapel," she said. "She's been moved from Whitechapel. I need to find out where." "And how do you propose to—" "There's a woman Helena Voss uses for certain inquiries. She gave me a name last week in case I needed it." Evelyn was already moving toward the wardrobe. "Her name is Marsh, not the baronet. Different Marsh entirely. She runs a laundry on Commercial Street, and she knows everyone in that part of the city." Clara stared at her. "You want to go to Whitechapel?" "Not tonight. Tomorrow, early, before the business of the day makes it impossible." She pulled out a plain wool dress, the least notable thing she owned, and laid it on the bed. "I need to go as myself, not as the Hartwell widow, or as close to not as I can manage." "And if someone recognizes you?" "Then they recognize me." She turned. "Clara, I need 4 days. That's all I have. I can spend them being cautious, or I can spend them being effective. I intend to be effective." Clara pressed her lips together. Then she began to help Evelyn select what to wear for a visit to a laundry on Commercial Street, which was not a task she had anticipated when she had taken this position, and which she accomplished with characteristic pragmatic competence. The laundry was easy enough to find, a low building behind a court off Commercial Street, always steaming, always loud, the kind of place that operated on its own complete and self-sufficient logic, indifferent to the rest of the city's pretensions. The woman named Marsh turned out to be approximately 50, short, built like someone had compressed a larger and more imposing person into a smaller frame, and possessed of the immediately apparent quality of someone who has been lied to so consistently by so many different kinds of people that she has developed an essentially infallible detector for it. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment when she arrived, then said, "You're the widow." "I am. Helena Voss sent word you might come." She turned back to the vat she'd been stirring and spoke without looking at Evelyn. "Mrs. Parr used to bring work here. Nice woman, quiet. Didn't talk about herself, which in my experience means there's plenty to talk about." She worked the paddle through the sheets. "She left Whitechapel 5 days ago. Someone paid her way out. Set her up somewhere. Gave her money for it." "Where?" "Stepney." Marsh pulled the paddle free and rested it against the side. "There's a boarding house on Narrow Street run by a woman named Gooding. That's where she is." She looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. "She's frightened." "Of what?" "Of what she's been asked to do." Marsh picked up the paddle again. "That's all I'll say about it. The rest is between you and her." Mrs. Parr was 34 and looked older, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has recently had it made heavier. She opened the door of the boarding house room with her hand gripping the frame in a way that said she'd considered not opening it at all, and she looked at Evelyn on the other side with an expression that was more resignation than surprise. "I knew someone would come," she said. "May I come in?" A pause. Then she stepped back. The room was small and clean and smelled of tallow candles. There was a single chair, a narrow bed, a trunk against the wall. Mrs. Parr sat on the edge of the bed and clasped her hands together in her lap and looked at them rather than at Evelyn. "I don't want to be part of this," she said, before Evelyn could speak. I want you to know that. I didn't want it from the start. Evelyn sat in the chair. Then tell me what you were asked to do. A man came to see me a week ago. Said he was investigating the circumstances of Lord Hartwell's death. Said he had reason to believe there were witnesses who hadn't been properly heard. She looked up briefly, then back down. He was pleasant about it. Very proper. Said I had a civic obligation. What did you tell him? What I saw. She said it like a woman stepping off a ledge, something committed and irreversible. I was sewing in the upstairs passage that evening. I'd stayed late. Lady Hartwell had wanted alterations finished that day, and I hadn't finished in time, and I didn't want to... She stopped. I heard them arguing. I'd heard them argue before. It wasn't unusual. Her hands tightened. But this time it was different, louder, and then it went quiet very suddenly, and then there was the sound of... She stopped again. It's all right, Evelyn said. She kept her voice steady because one of them needed to be. You can say it. The sound of someone falling, Mrs. Parr said quietly. A heavy sound. Not something you mistake for anything else. The room was very still. What did you see? Evelyn asked. Specifically. You, ma'am, at the top of the landing, standing there. She finally looked up, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who hasn't been sleeping. Your hands were... You were holding them out in front of you, like this. She lifted her own hands, palms out, a gesture of stopping or pushing or both. And then you saw me, and you... She paused. You didn't say anything. You just looked at me. And I went back into the sewing room and I sat there until I heard the house start to move, and then I left. Silence. And you told the investigator this, Evelyn said. Yes. Barely a whisper. But then he came back. 2 days later. And this time he wasn't alone, and he wasn't pleasant, and he asked me to say something I didn't see. She looked at Evelyn with an expression that was trying to be hard and wasn't quite managing it. He wanted me to say I saw you push him deliberately, that I saw it clear, that there was no doubt. Her voice had developed a slight tremor that she was doing her best to control. He said if I was willing to say that, he could make certain difficulties I was having, money difficulties, go away entirely. And if I wasn't willing to say it, he'd create different difficulties, Evelyn finished. Yes. There was a long silence. Evelyn sat very still, looking at this woman on the edge of a bed in a small room in Stepney, and she understood, completely, with the full weight of her own experience behind the understanding, exactly what had been done to her, the particular mechanics of it. Take someone already frightened, already in difficulty, and give them a choice between something they don't want to do and something they can't afford not to do. It was not complicated. It was simply brutal. What you actually saw, Evelyn said carefully, was a woman at the top of a landing with her hands extended. You heard an argument before that. You heard a fall. You did not see what caused the fall. Mrs. Parr looked at her. Is that accurate? Evelyn asked. A long pause. That's accurate. Then that is what happened, Evelyn said. What you saw is what you saw. Nothing more. Nothing that was added after the fact. She leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Parr, I am not here to threaten you. I'm not here to purchase your silence. I'm here because you've been put in an impossible position by people who have no consideration for you at all. You're a mechanism to them, not a person. And I thought you deserved to be asked what you actually want. The woman stared at her. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, not quite, but the beginning of the conditions under which relief might eventually be possible. What I want, she said slowly, is to not have to lie. I never wanted to lie. Then don't. Evelyn held her gaze. What you saw is exactly enough without the lie, Mrs. Parr. You were there. You saw what you saw. And if you're asked to testify to what you actually saw, with no additions and no alterations, you have nothing to fear from me. And the money difficulties. Write them down. Every one of them. The sum, the creditor, the terms. Evelyn reached into her coat and produced a card, Baxter's card, her solicitor. Bring them to this man. Tell him I sent you. Tell him it's in connection with the Hartwell matter. She paused. I'm not wealthy, Mrs. Parr. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I can help within what I actually have. Mrs. Parr looked at the card for a long time. Then she took it. Boy, she was back at Hartwell House by noon, and the letter from Sir Edmund's solicitors was already waiting on the hall table as though it had timed its arrival specifically to coincide with hers. It was longer than the first one. It contained a phrase she had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Certain material evidence pertaining to the events of the evening of 14th March, 1861. They had decided, or Sir Edmund had decided, that what Fenwick had assembled was sufficient. They were not waiting any longer. She read it standing up, coat still on, hat still on, in the entrance hall with the cold air from outside still clinging to her. When she finished, she folded it precisely along its creases, set it on the table with the same care she applied to every piece of paper that had the potential to destroy her, and walked into the study. She sat at her desk. She thought about Mrs. Parr's hands, like this, palms out. She thought about the seamstress in the upstairs passage, sitting alone after, until the house started to move. She thought about Dr. Hale with his careful report, his conspicuous neutrality, his small, costly act of mercy. She would need to speak to Dr. Hale. And then she thought about the letter on the hall table from Adrian Vale, the Duke of Ashmore, who had written to her about railway ventures and probably meant something else entirely, and who had resources and influence that she currently did not. And she thought about the line she had spent every year of her adult life refusing to cross. The line that said, "Depend on yourself, ask no one for what you cannot return, accept no help that comes with terms you can't afford to pay." She thought about that line for a long time. Then she picked up the draft response to Vale's letter, crossed out what she'd written, and started again. Differently this time. Not committing to nothing. Committing to something small, carefully worded, leaving room to retreat. But something. She hated every word of it. She sent it anyway. He called 2 days later in the afternoon, precisely at the time he had suggested in his reply, which told her he was the kind of man who arrived when he said he would, which was rarer than it should have been. She received him in the drawing room, which she had fully uncovered now. The dust sheets removed, the furniture exposed in all its slightly worn, under-maintained reality. She hadn't tried to make it look better than it was. She didn't see the point of performing solvency for a man who would see through it in 30 seconds. Adrian Vale in full daylight and in a room smaller than a ballroom was, she discovered, a different proposition from Adrian Vale glimpsed across an entrance hall. He was 40, perhaps, with a face that had been good-looking once and had become more interesting with age. The bones still fine, but with something added to them by time and experience that improved rather than diminished. He moved through the room with the same unconscious certainty she'd noticed at the Ashford dinner, the certainty of someone who has never once had to earn his right to take up space. And she registered this as something to be aware of rather than a flaw, the way you register a weather pattern as something to account for rather than complain about. He took the chair she indicated and declined tea, and looked at her with the direct, unperformed attention of someone who was genuinely curious and had decided not to spend time pretending otherwise. "I'll be direct," he said. "So will I," she said. "Please." "I've been watching the northern expansion route for 2 years. I have a significant interest in whether it succeeds. I know that you and Callaway have taken a position in it, and I know the structure, roughly, because Callaway is thorough, but not impossible to read if you know what you're looking for." She absorbed this without expression. And I think the position is sound. I think your analysis is correct and the established houses are wrong. And I've thought this independently since before your name became attached to it. He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to join the venture. As a third party with a commensurate investment that would resolve your short-term capital problem and allow you to drop the textile mill position, which I think is more fragile than it appears." Silence. "That's the straightforward version," he said. "Would you like the less straightforward version?" "Yes," she said. "I have also been informed, through channels I won't specify, that you're facing significant legal pressure from Sir Edmund Reeve that has nothing to do with the estate's financial position and everything to do with the circumstances of your husband's death." He didn't look away, didn't soften it. "I want you to know that I'm aware of that, and that my interest in this venture is not contingent on it going away. I'm not offering help in exchange for information or silence or any other currency." He paused. "I'm offering a business proposition on its own merits. What happens with Reeve is a separate matter." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Because the investment is sound." "That's not what I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I've watched this city eat people for 3 decades, and I've rarely seen anyone refuse to be eaten with as much precision as you have." He said the word like he'd tested several others first and settled on that one specifically. "I find it worth supporting." "That's a very generous interpretation of my circumstances." "It's an accurate one." She stood and walked to the window, not away from him, exactly, but giving herself the 6 feet of distance she needed to think without his attention at close range. Outside, Mayfair continued its indifferent operations. A carriage, a woman with a dog, a delivery boy going somewhere with purpose. The thing she hated about needing help was not the needing. It was the fact that needing it always meant giving something, some piece of her own territory, some measure of her autonomy, some proportion of the future she was building. She had not come back to London to rebuild one cage and walk into another, but the mill position was fragile. She'd known it when she'd agreed to it, and the solicitor's letter was sitting on the hall table, and Mrs. Parr had 4 days' worth of safety at most before Sir Edmund's people tried a different kind of pressure. And Baxter had written yesterday to tell her that the estate's outstanding debts had acquired a new and impatient creditor who had purchased 2 of the smaller notes specifically to accelerate the timeline. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. "I'll need to see your figures," she said, still looking out the window. "Of course. And I'll need Calloway to be present at any discussion of the venture structure. He has an equal stake in this." "Understood." "And the investment is structured as a straightforward commercial partnership. No personal obligations, no social currency, no expectation of anything other than the returns the venture produces." A pause. "Agreed." She turned from the window. "Then we can discuss it." The document from Baxter arrived the next morning, and it was worse than she'd expected, which meant it was the thing she'd been afraid of rather than the thing she'd been preparing for. And there was a difference. The new creditor who had purchased the outstanding notes was not, it turned out, simply an opportunistic investor looking for a distressed asset. Baxter had dug further, because Baxter always dug further, and what he had found was this. The purchasing entity, a holding company with a name that meant nothing, had, behind it, the financial interest of Sir Edmund Reeve. He hadn't just been building a legal case against her, he'd been buying the debt. She read Baxter's letter twice. Then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed steadily for a moment, which was the closest she ever came to losing composure when she was alone, and which she allowed herself because alone was the only place she could afford to let anything show. He owned 2 of the outstanding notes, totaling just under £4,000. If those notes were called in, and under the terms of the original debt, they could be called in on 90 days' notice, it would collapse the timeline entirely. She would have not 6 months, but 3. And 3 months was not enough, with or without Vale's capital injection, with or without the railway returns beginning to come in. 3 months was the difference between fighting and losing before the fight had properly begun. She reached for the pen. Her hand was steadier than she felt. She wrote to Baxter first. Find out when the notes were purchased. Find out if there are others. Then to Calloway. We have a problem. Come this afternoon if you can. Then she stopped and looked at the letter from Vale, still on the desk, unanswered since their meeting 2 days ago. She had been going to write him a careful, considered response. Take another day with it. Test the terms from every angle before committing to anything. She didn't have another day. She wrote the response to Vale in 12 minutes, which was the fastest she had ever committed to anything of consequence, and every word of it felt like walking out onto ice that she couldn't verify the thickness of. She sent it before she could revise it into uselessness. Calloway came that afternoon and sat across from her desk and looked at Baxter's letter without speaking for a long time. He's been moving on 2 fronts, Calloway said finally. Yes. The legal pressure and the financial pressure simultaneously. He set the letter down. He doesn't want to wait for the estate to collapse on its own timeline. He wants to choose the timeline. Yes. Which means he knows about the railway position. He looked at her. Someone told him? The room felt slightly smaller than it had before. She had thought about this since Baxter's letter arrived. Who knew the full structure of what she was building? The railway, the mill, the capital shortfall. Calloway, Helena, Baxter. Clara, in the general way that a good lady's maid was always aware of the shape of things. And Vale, now, partially. None of them were obvious candidates for informing Sir Edmund, but obvious candidates were rarely the ones who did it. We proceed as planned, she said, with one change. Vale's capital comes in faster than we discussed. I'm going to ask him to move within the week. Calloway looked at her carefully. That's very fast. Yes. It also signals urgency. He'll know something has shifted. He'll know anyway, she said. He's not stupid, and I don't intend to pretend otherwise. And you trust him? She considered this question, genuinely, not as a formality. She had been turning it over since the afternoon in this same room. Did she trust Adrian Vale? She didn't know him. She'd had one conversation with him. He had offered her something useful and claimed he expected nothing particular in return, and she had learned at considerable cost to be cautious about men who claimed to want nothing. I trust the business logic, she said. For now, that's sufficient. Calloway nodded once, the decisive nod she'd come to recognize. Then let's move. She met with Vale 2 days later, this time at his offices near Pall Mall, which were exactly what she expected. Large, well-appointed, the accumulated confidence of several generations of wealth displayed in the particular way that old money displays things, which is by not appearing to display them at all. He had the figures ready. She went through them with Calloway at her side, and the three of them worked through the structure for 2 hours with the focused, occasionally contentious efficiency of people who are all too smart to waste time performing agreement. Vale pushed back twice, once on the equity split, which she held firm on, and once on the governance structure of the partnership, where she conceded a point because he was, in that specific instance, correct. She disliked that he was correct. She noted it anyway, because accuracy mattered more than being right. When they emerged from the office into the cold afternoon, Calloway was quiet for a moment and then said, He's going to want more than the venture. I know, she said. Are you prepared for that? She looked at the street ahead, the carriages, the gray sky, the ordinary machinery of a city that had never once adjusted itself to accommodate her. I'm prepared for a great many things. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. What? The note came that evening. Not a letter. A note, slipped under the front door sometime after 8, found by Clara when she went to check the locks. 4 lines. No signature. The statement has been prepared. Miss Parr will be asked to sign it on Friday. Your solicitor will receive a copy the same afternoon. There is a meeting planned for the following Monday at which Sir Edmund intends to present his case to a magistrate. You have less time than you thought. 4 lines. Friday was tomorrow. She stood in the entrance hall holding the note and looked at it until the words stopped being words and became simply the shape of the problem she had to solve in the next. She looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. 18 hours. Mrs. Parr was in a boarding house in Stepney. Sir Edmund's people were going to her tomorrow. If she signed a statement that contained the addition, the deliberate push, the clear intent, then what Fenwick had assembled became something else entirely. Something that could stand in front of a magistrate and make an argument. 18 hours. She went to the desk, pulled out a fresh sheet, and wrote 3 letters simultaneously, moving between them, which was something she'd never done before, and which required a quality of fractured attention that was unpleasant but functional. The first was to Baxter. You need to be available at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. There's an action that must be taken before 9. The second was to Helena. I need you tonight if you can come. I know the hour is indecent. I'm sorry. The third was to Adrian Vale. This one was harder. She wrote it and crossed it out and wrote it again and sat looking at it and recognized, with the particular nausea of someone who has been self-sufficient for so long that asking for help has become almost physically difficult, that she was about to ask for something she had not asked anyone for in 3 years. Not money, not strategy. Something different, something that required a level of trust she had not extended to a single person since arriving back in London. She told him what had happened. The note, the timeline, Mrs. Parr, what the statement would say, what it would mean when it reached the magistrate. She did not tell him the full truth of what had happened the night George died. But she told him enough. Enough that anyone reading it would understand the shape of what she was facing and why it could not be faced alone. She sealed it and sent Clara with it immediately, with instructions that it was to be delivered tonight, whatever the hour, and that she was to wait for a response. Then she sat in the study with the fire burning down and the clock ticking, and Helena still 20 minutes away at best. And she looked at the room that had become, over the past weeks, something that was almost hers. The papers, the ledgers, the notes in her own handwriting, the slowly emerging shape of something she was building, and she thought about what would happen if it all came apart tomorrow, in a magistrate's room, in front of a statement signed by a frightened woman who had been given no real choice. She thought about running. She thought about it carefully and honestly, the way she thought about every option, giving it its full weight. Then she decided, for the last time, that she was done running. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it standing still. Clara came back at 10:30 with Vale's response, which was a single line. "I'll be at your door at 6. And then, not 2 minutes after Clara handed her the note, before she had fully processed what it meant or what it required of her or where it might lead, there was a sound from the front of the house, not a knock, something harder, more abrupt. And when Mrs. Gaines went to the door, she came back pale and said there were 2 men outside who said they were there on behalf of Sir Edmund Reeves' solicitors, and they wanted Mrs. Hartwell to accompany them to sign an agreement tonight, at this hour, without notice, without Baxter, without anyone. Evelyn stood up from the desk. She had never felt so calm in her life, which meant she had never been so close to the edge of something irreversible. "Tell them," she said to Mrs. Gaines in a voice that carried through the hallway with perfect clarity, "that Mrs. Hartwell is not available tonight, and that if they present themselves at this house again without proper legal notice and her solicitor present, she will have them removed." A pause. Voices from the hallway. Mrs. Gaines came back. "They say they'll return in the morning." "I know they will," Evelyn said. The room was very quiet. The fire had burned to embers. The clock on the mantel was ticking with its patient, structural indifference. She stood in the middle of her own study in her own house, in the city that had tried to break her, and she waited for Helena, and she waited for morning, and she did not move. Helena arrived at 11:15, which was not bad for a woman who had been woken from sleep, dressed in a hurry, and made her way across London in a hired carriage without explanation. She came into the study with her coat still buttoned and her hair not quite finished, and took one look at Evelyn's face and said, "Tell me everything." Evelyn told her everything. Not the partial version, not the managed version, not the version she had been giving people in careful, calculated doses. All of it. The note. Sir Edmund's men at the door, Mrs. Parr and the statement being prepared for Friday, Baxter and the morning, and Vale's single line of response. And then, because Helena had asked her once with the directness of a woman who had earned the answer, and because Evelyn had run out of the particular energy required to keep things compartmentalized, the rest of it too. What had happened with George? The full shape of it, not just the outline. Helena listened without moving. When Evelyn finished, the room was quiet, except for the clock and the settling sounds of an old house at night. "Right," Helena said. She unbuttoned her coat. "Then here's what we do." They worked until 2 in the morning, the two of them at the study desk with papers spread between them, and what emerged from those 3 hours was something that was not quite a plan so much as an architecture, a structure of responses, each one contingent on what the previous one produced, each one designed to withstand being partially wrong without collapsing entirely. Helena was good at this in a way that surprised Evelyn slightly, not because she had underestimated her, but because good strategy in the specific register they were working in. Not military, not financial, but the particular tactical intelligence required to navigate a system designed against you with the limited resources available to people the system didn't recognize as full participants, was rare, and Helena had it in abundance. Baxter needs to file a formal objection to any statement taken from Mrs. Parr without independent legal counsel present, Helena said, cross-referencing something she'd written against something Evelyn had laid out. That doesn't stop it, but it slows it. It creates a record that the process was challenged. It also tells Sir Edmund we know about the statement. He already knows we know. The note under your door wasn't anonymous by accident. It was sent to give you enough time to react visibly. He wants to see how you move when you're frightened. Evelyn looked at her. Then we don't move like we're frightened. We move like we were expecting this, Helena said. Because we should have been. That landed the way true things sometimes do. Cleanly, without softening. Evelyn absorbed it and filed it under lessons that cost something to learn. Go on. They went on. By the time Helena left at 2:30, Evelyn had a list of 7 things that needed to happen before 9 o'clock in the morning, ordered by priority, and assigned to either herself, Baxter, or Vale, whose role in the morning was the one she was least certain about and most dependent on. She had told Helena about the letter to Vale. Helena had listened and said nothing immediately, and then said, "Is he trustworthy?" "I don't know yet." "That's honest, at least." "I can't afford to find out slowly," Evelyn said, "so I'm finding out fast." Helena had looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to read, something between concern and the particular respect you have for someone doing something you wouldn't do yourself. Just be careful about what you need from him and what you want from him. They're not always the same thing. Evelyn had said she understood. She had been fairly certain she did. Vale arrived at 6 o'clock precisely, as he had said he would. He came alone, no secretary, no attendant, which she noted. He came into the study and looked at the papers on the desk and the 2 chairs that had clearly been occupied for most of the night, and the cold fireplace and the empty tea things, and said nothing about any of it. "I need 3 things from you," Evelyn said. She was standing at the desk. She had not slept. She was past the point where not sleeping felt like a hardship, and into the territory where it simply became the condition of existence. "I'll tell you what they are, and you can tell me if any of them are outside what you're prepared to do." "All right." "The first is straightforward. Baxter needs your solicitor's office to file a joint formal objection this morning to any witness statement taken under duress or without independent representation. Your name on the filing carries weight, mine doesn't." "That's manageable. What's the second?" "The second is less straightforward." She looked at him directly. "I need access to information about the holding company that purchased the outstanding notes on this estate. I know it connects to Sir Edmund. I need that connection documented, traced through the purchasing structure to his personal financial interest, clearly enough to present to a magistrate as evidence of bad faith." Vale was quiet for a moment. "That kind of documentation requires access to financial records that aren't public." "Yes." "Which means someone with the right kind of relationships in the city would need to obtain it through informal channels." "Yes." Another pause. "You're asking me to do something that isn't strictly legal." "I'm asking you to find out what is, in fact, true, and obtain the evidence that proves it," she said. "What Sir Edmund has done isn't strictly legal either. The question is whether the truth is available or not." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the calculation happening, not moral calculation, she thought, but practical. The risk, the exposure, the consequences if it came apart wrong. She was asking him to put his name in proximity to something that couldn't be walked back. "What's the third thing?" he asked. She took a breath. This was the one that had taken her the longest to write the night before, the one she had crossed out and rewritten, the one that required something she had spent years building walls around. "I need you to be present when I speak to the magistrate, not as a legal representative, well, Baxter handles that, as a witness to the character of what's being done here. Someone whose word carries weight that mine, as a widowed woman of questionable social standing, does not currently carry in a room like that." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was the silence of someone processing something that had more weight than the words used to say it. "You're asking me to stand with you publicly," he said. "Yes. Knowing what it will cost you in terms of what people will say about it. I'm aware of what people will say. And knowing what it will do to your argument that you're managing this independently and don't require rescue." She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking to be rescued. I'm asking for a witness. Those are different things. Vale stood very still for a moment, and she watched his face, which was doing the thing she'd noticed it did when he was thinking seriously. A particular stillness, everything held slightly internal, like a man who had learned that his expressions were legible and had developed the habit of managing them. Then, All right. All right to which? All of it, he said. All three. Baxter arrived at 7. He was 60, spare, with the alert, slightly compressed quality of a man who has practiced law for 35 years and long since accepted that his best work happened when other people were at their worst. He looked at the papers Evelyn put in front of him, listened to what she said, asked 4 precise questions, and then set to work at the other end of the desk with the focused silence of a craftsman who doesn't need to be managed. By 8, the joint filing was drafted. By 8:30, Vale's solicitor had been reached, reviewed it, and signed on. By 9, it was submitted. Evelyn stood in the entrance hall after Baxter left and looked at the clock and thought, 1. 1 thing done. 6 more. Clara appeared at her elbow holding toast. You need to eat. I know. You said that yesterday. I know that too. She took the toast. The second thing took longer, because the second thing involved Vale operating through channels that worked on their own schedule regardless of urgency, and because Evelyn had to simply let him work and not hover over it, which was harder than anything else she'd been asked to do. She spent the day at the desk. Correspondence. The railway projections, which still needed attention regardless of what else was happening. A letter to Mrs. Parr, carefully worded, reminding her, without pressure, without anything that could be construed as intimidation, that her solicitor was available and that whatever happened in the next several days, the truth she had already told Evelyn was sufficient and required no additions. She wrote that letter 3 times before it said what she wanted. At noon, Helena came by with information about Sir Edmund's schedule. He was meeting with Partridge, the contested inheritance solicitor, tomorrow afternoon, which meant whatever legal machinery he was setting in motion was moving towards something specific and imminent. Helena had obtained this through her contacts without explaining how, and Evelyn didn't ask, which was the understanding they'd arrived at without needing to state it. How are you holding up? Helena asked, standing by the window with her tea. I'm functioning. That's not... I know it's not what you asked. Evelyn looked at her. I'll hold up better when this is over. And when it's over, after all of this, what do you actually want? It was such a simple question that it caught her off guard. She'd been so deep in the mechanics of survival, the figures, the filings, the careful management of every variable, that the question of what she actually wanted, past the immediate crisis, past the 6-month deadline, past Reeve and Fenwick and Mrs. Parr's testimony, and all the rest of it, that question had become something she deferred indefinitely, the way you defer a meal when you're too busy to be hungry. To not be afraid anymore, she said. Then, because that was too much, too bare. To make something that's mine, that I built, that nobody can take. Helena looked at her for a moment. That's a good answer, she said quietly. Vale's message came at 4 o'clock. It was brief, written in the same contained, precise hand as his previous correspondence, and it said, The chain is documented. 3 entities between Reeve and the notes, all traceable. My solicitor has the paperwork. Come at 5 if you can. She was at his offices at 5 minutes to 5. The paperwork was, as he'd said, complete. 3 shell entities, each one nested inside the next. The ultimate beneficial owner buried deep enough to require real effort to reach. But the effort had been made, or someone working for Vale had made it, and the result was a chain of ownership that led, without ambiguity, from the purchased debt notes directly to Sir Edmund Reeve's personal financial interests. He had not simply been building a legal case to force her out. He had been acquiring the instrument of her destruction at the same time. Debt notes purchased strategically, at the right moment, held in structures designed to obscure his involvement until he chose to reveal it. It was thorough. It was cold. It was the kind of move that required someone to be thinking 3 steps ahead for a sustained period. She looked at the documents. She looked at them the way she looked at ledgers, carefully and completely, making sure she understood the full shape of what she was seeing. "This is usable," she said. "It's more than usable." Vale was standing across the table, and she was aware of him watching her with that particular quality of attention. It's evidence of a direct conflict of interest in any legal proceeding Sir Edmund initiates. His claim to be acting in the estate's interest becomes untenable the moment this is in front of a magistrate. He's a financial interested party, not a disinterested family representative. "It doesn't make the question of George's death go away," she said. "No, but it reframes who is asking the question and why." He paused. "What happened that night? I don't know the full story. You've told me enough to understand the shape of it. But I want you to know that what I know doesn't change. Vale," she looked at him. "I appreciate that, genuinely. But I can't. I need to keep thinking clearly tonight, and there are things I'm not able to let myself think about until this is done." She held his gaze. "Can you understand that?" A pause. "Yes. Thank you." She took the documents, put them in her case, and left. She needed Baxter. Baxter looked at the documents for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he put them down and looked at Evelyn across his desk and said, "Where did you get these? Does it matter?" "It might matter if they're challenged. They're accurate. Every figure and every connection is verifiable independently if someone does the work." He considered this. Then, "All right." He picked up his pen. "In that case, they matter a great deal." He began to write. Sir Edmund's legal position depends on presenting himself as a family member acting in the interests of an estate that has been mismanaged. The moment we show he holds financial instruments against that estate, he becomes an adversary with a personal financial stake. The entire framing of his complaint shifts. "From protecting the family to predatory acquisition," Evelyn said. "Precisely." Baxter looked up. "Combined with the formal objection to the statement process, and if Mrs. Parr's testimony can be limited to what she actually witnessed without the additions. I'm working on that. How solid is she?" Evelyn thought about the woman on the edge of the bed in the Stepney boarding house, hands clasped in her lap, saying, "I don't want to be part of this." "She's frightened," she said honestly, "but I think she's also tired of being frightened. Those aren't the same thing." "No," Baxter agreed. "They're not." He worked for another 2 hours. Evelyn sat on the other side of his desk and went through the railway figures because they still needed to exist regardless of everything else, and the room had the particular quality of two people doing important work in parallel, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but occupied. When he finally set down his pen and looked at what he'd produced, he said, "We file this tomorrow morning, before Partridge has his meeting with Reeve. We get this in front of a magistrate before they do." Evelyn looked at him. "You think we can?" "I think we have about an equal chance of getting there first and getting there second," he said, with the dry honesty she valued in him above everything else. "I prefer the first option, so I'll be here at 6 tomorrow. I'll be here at 5:30. He almost smiled. "Of course you will." Friday morning arrived with clear, cold air and the specific quality of light that comes with early autumn in London, sharp and clean and not quite warm. Evelyn had slept for 3 hours, which was better than nothing, and she was at Baxter's offices at 5:30, as she'd said. Vale arrived at 6, as he'd said. Baxter filed at 7:15. By 9 o'clock, they had a response from the magistrate's clerk. The matter was scheduled for a formal hearing on Monday at 11. The same Monday, Sir Edmund had planned to present his case. Evelyn sat in Baxter's waiting room, a small, plain room with 2 chairs and a window onto the street, and looked at the clerk's letter and understood, for the first time in weeks, what it felt like to have moved first instead of reacting. It was a different feeling from what she'd expected. Not triumphant, not even particularly satisfying. More like the feeling of solid ground after a long time of testing ice. Not happiness, exactly, but the specific relief of weight-bearing. Vale came into the waiting room at that point and saw her sitting there and said, "Well?" "Monday," she said. 11 o'clock. Same day as his meeting with Partridge. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, quick and contained. "Then we have 2 days. 2 days?" She looked at the letter. "I need to go to Stepney today. I need to see Mrs. Parr before anyone else does. Do you want company? She considered this. The practical argument for yes, security, witness, the visible presence of someone with a name that people in Mrs. Parr's situation tended to find reassuring or at least attention-worthy. The practical argument for no, this was a conversation between two women, and the presence of a duke, however well-intentioned, would change the texture of it in ways that might make it worse. No, she said. I need to go alone. He accepted this without argument, which she noted. Mrs. Parr answered the door in Stepney and looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or more frightened. Evelyn came in, sat down, and told her what had happened. Not all of it, but enough. The filing, the magistrate, the documentation of Sir Edmund's financial interest, the fact that when she stood in front of the magistrate on Monday, whatever she said, she would be saying it in a room where the full context was on the table, not just her words pulled out of their surroundings, but the whole structure of what had been done and why. Mrs. Parr listened with her hands in her lap, the same posture as last time. When Evelyn finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "They came yesterday, the man from before. He said I needed to sign the statement by tomorrow." "Did you?" She looked at the floor. "I said I needed more time. He said there wasn't more time." She swallowed. "I said I'd do it." "To get him to leave." She looked up. "I haven't signed anything." Evelyn met her eyes. "You don't have to sign anything that isn't true, Mrs. Parr. What you saw, a woman on a landing, hands extended, a fall, a sudden silence, that's what you saw. That is your testimony. It's enough. They'll say I'm protecting you. Let them." Evelyn kept her voice level, even. "The truth doesn't require your additions to be the truth. It requires only that you say what you actually know." Mrs. Parr looked at her for a long time. There was something happening in her face, a slow, difficult internal negotiation, the kind you have when you have been told by everyone around you that the thing you know and the thing you're being asked to say are the same thing, and you have to decide whether to trust your own experience or the version you've been given. "I'll say what I saw," she said finally. "Nothing else." "That's all I've ever asked." There was a pause. Then Mrs. Parr said with a different quality, quieter, more personal. Did he hurt you badly?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. Evelyn looked at her steadily and said, "Yes, for a long time." Mrs. Parr nodded once, slowly, like someone confirming something they'd already known. "I thought so," she said. "You could see it. Not always, but sometimes." Evelyn didn't answer that because there was nothing to answer. She simply sat with it for a moment. In this small room in Stepney with the tallow candle smell and the narrow bed and the autumn light coming through the single window, and let it be what it was. Then she stood. "Baxter's name is on this card. He'll arrange for someone to accompany you on Monday. You won't go alone." "Thank you," Mrs. Parr said, taking it. Then, "Mrs. Hartwell." She paused. "I'm sorry for all of it, for being part of the beginning of this." "You were put in an impossible position," Evelyn said. "You've done the best you could with it. That's enough." She meant it. It was not a performance. It was simply true. The 2 days before Monday had a different quality from the weeks that had preceded them. Not easier. There was still Partridge and Reeve, and the question of what they would present when they arrived at the magistrate's rooms and discovered that Evelyn had gotten there first, but different. The frantic reactivity of the last 3 weeks had shifted into something more controlled. She was no longer chasing the edge of something. She was standing on ground she had chosen. She met with Baxter on Saturday to go through what he would present. She met with Vale on Sunday, briefly, to go through the financial documentation one more time, make sure every link in the chain held up under the questions it would face. She reviewed the railway projections because they still existed and still mattered, and the life she was trying to build didn't stop requiring attention simply because the threat to it had reached its critical point. On Sunday evening, Helena came for dinner. It was an unremarkable meal. Mrs. Gaines had produced something simple and competent with the limited kitchen stores. And they sat in the partially reclaimed dining room and talked about things that were not the hearing, which was a relief Evelyn hadn't anticipated needing and discovered she'd needed badly. Helena talked about her own estate, which she had been managing successfully for 4 years now, and which had turned from a liability into something she was quietly proud of. She talked about a woman she knew who had started a small lending library in Bloomsbury that was doing remarkably well. She talked about a piece of music she'd heard and liked. It was, in its ordinary way, one of the more restorative evenings Evelyn had spent since returning to London. When Helena was leaving, she paused in the entrance hall and said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already done something they didn't think you could do. I haven't won anything yet. No, but you forced them to fight you on equal ground, which they expected to avoid entirely." Helena pulled on her gloves. "That's not nothing." Monday arrived. The magistrate's rooms near the Strand were not imposing in the way that courts were imposing. They were simply offices with a particular kind of gravity in them, the accumulated weight of decisions having been made there, legal machinery grinding through its processes in the particular combination of procedure and human messiness that characterized any system for resolving disputes. Evelyn arrived with Baxter at 11:15. Vale was there already, which she registered. Calloway had come too. He had insisted, and she had found, when she saw him standing in the corridor outside the magistrate's rooms, that she was unexpectedly glad he had. Sir Edmund arrived at 11:05 with Partridge and 2 other men she didn't recognize. He saw her across the corridor, and there was a moment, brief, entirely unperformed, genuine, where something crossed his face that was not quite the expression of a man who expected to see her there. Not panic, but a recalibration so sudden and visible that it told her everything she needed to know about the assumptions he'd been operating under. He'd expected to walk into that room first. He had not. She held his gaze across the corridor and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The documents Baxter was holding said it. The filing from Thursday morning said it. The fact that she was standing here at all, on her own 2 feet, with her solicitor and her business partner and a duke as witness, instead of signing something in a solicitor's office late on a Tuesday night when she had no counsel and no warning, that said it. His jaw tightened. He looked away. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. Baxter presented first. He was methodical and unhurried and gave the magistrate the full picture: the documentation of Sir Edmund's financial interest, the chain of holding entities, the purchased debt notes, the evidence that the legal pressure being brought against Mrs. Hartwell was not an act of family stewardship, but the second arm of a coordinated financial acquisition. He was clear about what he was and wasn't claiming. He wasn't claiming Sir Edmund had acted unlawfully in purchasing the notes. He was claiming that Sir Edmund's legal complaint could not be heard as a disinterested family matter when he held a direct financial interest in the outcome. Partridge pushed back hard. He was good, sharp, practiced, with the particular aggression of a man who wins by making the other side feel they're on unstable ground. He questioned the provenance of the financial documentation. He questioned the relevance of it. He attempted, twice, to redirect the hearing back to the question of George's death, because that was what he'd come prepared to argue. The magistrate, a man named Holt, 60 years old, with the weathered patience of someone who had been doing this long enough to have seen most varieties of procedural maneuver, let Partridge make his arguments, and then he said, with the kind of measured directness that didn't require volume to be authoritative, "Mr. Partridge, before this hearing proceeds to the question of the late Lord Hartwell's death, I want to be satisfied on the matter Mr. Baxter has raised, because if Mr. Baxter's documentation is accurate, it changes the framing of what we're here to determine." Partridge said the documentation should be treated with skepticism. "I'll determine that," Magistrate Holt said. "Thank you." The 90 minutes produced no final verdict. What they produced was this: a formal request from the magistrate to Sir Edmund's solicitors to provide, within 10 days, a full accounting of his financial interest in the Hartwell estate, including the purchased debt notes and their acquisition history. Until that accounting was received and reviewed, no legal complaint against Mrs. Hartwell pertaining to the circumstances of Lord Hartwell's death would be heard. 10 days. And within those 10 days, Sir Edmund was required to disclose what he had spent months concealing. It was not over. She knew it was not over. There was still the question of Mrs. Parr and Dr. Hale and the seamstress who had sat in the upstairs passage and heard things she hadn't been supposed to hear. There was still Fenwick and whatever he had assembled. There was still the debt and the railway timeline and the estate in all its complicated, crumbling reality. But when Evelyn walked out of that building into the cold October air, with Baxter at her left side and Calloway saying something about the figures and the sounds of London going on indifferently all around her, she understood that the shape of the contest had changed. Not in her favor, not completely, not yet, but differently, in a way that was not going to change back. She stopped on the steps and stood in the air for a moment. Behind her, Vale came to stand beside her. Not close, not saying anything, simply present. "He didn't expect you to move first," he said, after a moment. "No." "He built a very careful trap," Vale said. "You just walked around it." She looked at the street, the carriages, the gray London sky with its particular quality of light, the city that had tried to bury her twice now, and had not, on either occasion, managed it. "I didn't walk around it," she said. "I made him step into it himself." Vale was quiet for a moment. Then, with a tone she hadn't heard from him before, something that was neither professional nor calculated, simply direct. "You're remarkable, you know." She turned to look at him, and she saw for the first time without the filter of calculation between them that he meant it in the plain and simple way that people mean things when they've stopped managing their expressions. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said with something that was not quite a smile but was the beginning of the conditions under which one might eventually be possible, "Don't say that yet. Wait until Thursday." He did smile at that. Small, genuine, nothing performed about it. She turned back to the street and walked down the steps and kept going. Thursday came and went without the disaster she'd half expected, which was itself a kind of information. Sir Edmund's solicitors had until the following Monday to produce the financial accounting magistrate Holt had requested, and in the silence of that 10-day window, Evelyn discovered something she hadn't anticipated. Waiting, when you had done everything within your power to shape the outcome, was harder than moving. Movement had a logic to it, a sequence of actions and consequences that kept the mind occupied. Waiting required a different discipline, the discipline of sitting still inside uncertainty without letting it hollow you out. She managed it by working. The railway projections needed a final review before Vale's capital injection could be formally structured. The textile mill position, which Vale had correctly identified as more fragile than it appeared, needed to be either strengthened or unwound, and she and Calloway spent 2 days determining which, concluding finally that unwinding it cleanly was better than holding a position neither of them fully trusted. The estate accounts needed attention. There were small creditors she could address immediately with what remained of her personal funds, and addressing them mattered both practically and symbolically, because the story of an estate was also the story of how its debts were treated, and she intended that story to be legible. She also wrote to Dr. Hale. This letter was the hardest thing she'd written in the entire month since returning to London. Dr. Hale was 63 now, retired, living in Cheltenham with his daughter's family. He had done her a singular kindness 3 years ago and had never, to her knowledge, spoken of it to anyone, and she had spent 3 years being aware that she owed him a debt she could not repay and that he held, in the form of what he knew, the capacity to destroy her if he ever chose to use it. She didn't write to threaten him or to purchase his continued silence. She wrote to tell him what was happening, plainly, completely, without asking him for anything except honesty. She told him about the magistrate and the hearing and the 10-day window. She told him that if he was contacted by anyone in connection with the case, she wanted him to say what he actually knew, in full, without omission, because she had decided that the version she had been surviving was no longer the one she intended to live inside. She sealed the letter and sent it, and then sat with the knowledge of having done it for a long moment, the way you sit after jumping from something high. The action complete, irreversible, the consequences still assembling themselves in the air around you. Fenwick came to see her on Wednesday of the second week, which she had not expected, but which did not surprise her. He came without advance notice, and Mrs. Gaines showed him into the drawing-room with the careful neutrality of a woman who had stopped being surprised by the variety of people her employer received. Evelyn came down to find him standing near the window with his coat on, looking at the garden. Still winter bare, the beds unattended, Something else on the long list of things the estate needed that it currently could not afford. "Mr. Fenwick," she said. He turned. He looked like a man who had been thinking carefully about something for several days and had arrived at a conclusion he was not entirely comfortable with. "Mrs. Hartwell, I apologize for coming without notice." "Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him and waited. "I've tendered my resignation to Sir Edmund," he said. She absorbed this. "When?" "Yesterday." He turned his hat in his hands, a small revealing gesture. "I want you to understand, I don't typically involve myself beyond the investigation. I find things. I report them. What clients do with what I find is their business." He paused. "But there are limits. And what was being asked of me, what was being asked of Mrs. Parr through my investigation, crossed them." "The additions to her statement?" "Yes." He set the hat on his knee and looked at her directly. "I didn't source those. I didn't suggest them. What I assembled was what I told you in the coffee house. Incomplete, ambiguous, not prosecutable as it stood. Someone in Partridge's office took what I provided and added what wasn't there." He paused. "I want you to know that." She looked at him carefully. He was telling the truth. She was fairly certain, and her read of people had been reliable enough over the past weeks to trust it. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because when the accounting is submitted on Monday and the full picture comes out, I expect the question of what my investigation actually found will become relevant, and I'd rather you know the shape of it from me than from whoever else starts picking it apart." He paused again. "And because—" He stopped. "Go on." "Because the note under your door," he said. "That was me." Silence. "I see," Evelyn said. "I know how it looks. It looks like a man who is working for someone trying to destroy me and simultaneously warning me about it," she said without heat. "It is complicated." "Yes?" He didn't try to make it less complicated than it was. "I can't tell you it was consistent. I can tell you it was the best I could manage inside a situation I should have walked away from sooner." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then, "Will you be willing to provide a written account of what your investigation actually found and what was added to it afterward, and by whom?" He was quiet for a long moment. "That would significantly damage my relationship with several clients who value discretion." "Yes, it would." Another pause, then, "Yes, I'll provide it." She nodded. "Then leave your address with Mrs. Gaines. Baxter will be in touch." Monday arrived with gray skies and the particular cold of London in late October that settled into stone buildings and refused to leave. Evelyn was at Baxter's offices by 8. Vale arrived 20 minutes later, and Calloway after that, and Helena came at 8:30 with coffee and the calm, focused efficiency of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment and is ready. Sir Edmund's solicitors submitted the accounting at precisely 10 o'clock, which was the deadline. Baxter had it in hand by 10:15 and spent 40 minutes going through it at his desk with the forensic patience of a man who reads documents the way other people read landscapes, looking for what isn't there as much as what is. At 11, he looked up. "It's incomplete," he said. "There are 2 additional entities not disclosed. I can see the gaps in the structure from what's here." He set the papers down. "He's hoping the magistrate accepts what's visible and doesn't ask for what isn't." "Will he?" Vale asked. "Not if I put it in front of him clearly enough." Baxter picked up his pen. "Give me an hour." They gave him an hour. Evelyn sat in the outer office and read through the railway timeline for the 4th time because there was nothing useful to be done with the hour except let Baxter use it, and the railway still needed to exist when this was over. Vale sat beside her at the other end of the small bench, reading something he'd brought with him. The room was quiet except for the scratch of pens from behind Baxter's door and the sound of the street outside. After a while, without looking up from her papers, she said, "You don't have to be here today." "I know," he said. "You've done what I asked. The documentation is filed. Baxter has everything he needs." "I know that too." She looked up from her papers. He was watching her with the same direct, unperformed attention she'd noticed in the drawing room of Hartwell House weeks ago, That first meeting when she'd told him she wasn't interested in a solution that required her to disappear into someone else's name. Then why? She started. Because I want to be, he said simply. Is that a sufficient answer? She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her chest, not the tightening she was used to feeling in this context, the old instinctive wariness, the reach for the wall. Something different, smaller, less defended. It's sufficient, she said, and went back to her papers. The second hearing with Magistrate Holt was at 2 o'clock, in the same rooms with the same procedural gravity and the same gray London light coming through the high windows. Sir Edmund arrived with Partridge and 3 men this time, which was either confidence or its opposite, and Evelyn arrived with Baxter and the Fenwick account in a sealed folder, and the knowledge that she had prepared for every version of this that she could imagine, and several she couldn't. Baxter presented the gaps in the accounting first. He was, as always, methodical, not dramatic, not aggressive, simply precise. He showed the magistrate where the structure of disclosed entities did not account for certain transfers, and he showed him where those transfers led, and he did it the way a man shows a map to someone who needs to understand a landscape before they can make a decision about how to cross it. Partridge objected 3 times. The magistrate overruled twice and sustained once, which was more balanced than Evelyn had expected, and which told her that Holt was a man who was actually listening, rather than a man who had already made up his mind. Then Baxter presented Fenwick's written account. This was the thing she had been most uncertain about. Fenwick's account detailed what he had found: 4 witnesses, partial and ambiguous evidence, a picture that raised questions without answering them, and then detailed, with the particular precision of a professional who had decided to be completely accurate regardless of cost, what had been added to that account by Partridge's office, and who had added it, and when. The room was quiet in a different way when Baxter finished reading. Partridge stood up. His objection was technical. The account was hearsay, unsupported, the product of a disgruntled former employee of his client. And he made it with the particular controlled force of a man who understands that a strong objection delivered well can sometimes save a position that has become structurally unsound. It was, Evelyn thought, a good objection. Technically. But Magistrate Holt looked at the objection and the account and the financial disclosure and its gaps and the whole assembled structure of what Baxter had laid in front of him. And he looked at it the way a man looks at something when he has been doing his job long enough to know the difference between a complicated situation and a straightforward one that has been made to appear complicated. And he said, "Mr. Partridge, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Was the witness statement provided by a Mrs. Parr in its current form reviewed and approved by this office before it was submitted as part of your client's complaint?" Partridge said it had been reviewed as a standard part of the process. "That isn't what I asked," Holt said. A pause. A very long pause. "It was reviewed," Partridge said again, and the repetition was its own kind of answer. Holt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the papers in front of him. Then he said, "I'm going to adjourn this hearing for 7 days. During that adjournment, I want a full accounting from both parties, including any communications between this office and the investigators engaged in this matter. I want that accounting complete and unredacted." He looked at Sir Edmund, not at Partridge. "Sir Edmund, I want to be plain with you about something. The question of what occurred on the night of Lord Hartwell's death is not a simple matter, and I do not dismiss it lightly. But the manner in which this complaint has been constructed, and I use that word deliberately, gives me serious cause to question whether the motivation behind it is what has been presented to this court." He paused. 7 days. Both parties. He closed the folder in front of him, and that was the end of it, for that day. The corridor outside the magistrate's rooms had the ordinary sounds of a public building: footsteps, voices, the distant mechanical noise of the street. Sir Edmund walked past Evelyn without looking at her, which she took as the particular statement it was. The statement of a man who has looked at where he is and understood that a retreat conducted without acknowledgement is less costly than a retreat conducted with it. Partridge, to his credit, looked at her. Not apologetically, simply acknowledging. The look of one professional recognizing another, across a divide that hadn't moved but whose shape had been clarified. She didn't say anything, neither did he. Baxter came to stand beside her and said, in his dry, economical way, "That went as well as it could have. It's not finished. No, but it's going in the right direction, and with significant momentum. 7 days from now, when they produce those communications, Partridge will be the one with the exposure problem. What's in those messages between his office and Fenwick is not going to help Sir Edmund's position." He paused. "It might actually help yours." She looked at him. "How?" "Because if the magistrate sees documented evidence of a witness statement being deliberately altered, the complaint doesn't just fail, it reflects on the person who brought it." Baxter said this the way he said most things, without drama, simply as the shape of what was true. "Sir Edmund wanted to expose you. He may end up exposing himself." The 7 days were the strangest of the entire period since she'd returned to London. The urgency that had structured everything, the deadlines, the responses, the constant calculation of what needed to happen next, softened slightly, not into ease, but into something that allowed for a longer view. She found herself doing things she hadn't done since arriving. Walking through the house properly, room by room, not cataloging deficiencies, but simply looking. The dust sheets were mostly gone now, the furniture was visible, and it was worn, and in some cases damaged, and in other cases simply old and solid and good. The house had bones. She had not let herself notice that before. She walked through the library on a Thursday afternoon. High ceilings, empty shelves, a smell of old wood, and something faintly mineral that she couldn't name. And she stood in the middle of it and thought about books, about filling it, about what she would put in it if she had the choosing. It was such an ordinary thought that it stopped her. She stood in the empty library and understood, with the particular clarity that comes when something you have been holding at arm's length for a very long time is finally close enough to touch, that she had been so focused on keeping the house that she had not yet let herself think about living in it. Helena came to dinner on Friday, and over the meal, better than the previous one, Mrs. Gaines having quietly expanded her repertoire now that the household felt less like a temporary arrangement, Evelyn said, "The northern expansion returns will start coming in properly in 14 months, enough to clear the remaining debt with room left. And the estate itself? Needs work, significant work. The east wing is borderline uninhabitable." She paused. "I've been looking at what it would take to restore the tenant cottages. The rental income has been negligible for 3 years because nobody has wanted to rent properties in that condition. Restore them properly, find good tenants. That becomes a reliable income stream that isn't dependent on any single investment position." Helena looked at her across the table. "You're talking about the long term?" "Yes." "That's different from the way you've been talking about this." Evelyn considered that. "I suppose it is." "It's good," Helena said simply. "It means you believe you're going to keep it." She hadn't framed it that way. But Helena was right, and she sat with that for a moment. The recognition that somewhere in the past weeks, without her quite noticing the transition, survival had begun to shade into something else, something that pointed forward rather than simply refusing to fall backward. The communications from Partridge's office arrived on the 6th day, and Baxter called her immediately. She came to his office, and he spread them on the desk, and they went through them together, and what they found was worse for Sir Edmund than she had expected, which was saying something. The messages were between Partridge's clerk and the person in his office who had handled the Fenwick account. They documented in the boring transactional language of office correspondence exactly what Fenwick had described in his written account, a deliberate decision to enhance Mrs. Parr's statement beyond what she had actually reported, the specific language that had been inserted, and the thing that changed everything, a note confirming that Sir Edmund himself had been consulted on the additions and had approved them. Not Partridge alone, not a clerk acting unilaterally. Sir Edmund, explicitly, on record. Baxter sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who has just read something that requires a moment before the full implications settle. "This isn't just a failed complaint," he said. "This is evidence of attempting to fabricate a criminal accusation." Evelyn looked at the document, at the clerk's note, at the date and the names. "Yes," she said, "he can be prosecuted for this." I know. Baxter looked at her. Do you want him to be? It was a real question, and he asked it because he was that kind of solicitor. The kind who understood that legal possibility and the human decision about what to do with it were not the same thing, and that his job included helping her think about both. She thought about it honestly. About Sir Edmund in the corridor, walking past her without looking. About the patience in his eyes at the Ashford dinner, the particular patience of a man who has never been seriously opposed in his life. About the footman with a grievance, and the seamstress on the landing, and the machinery of a system that had been assembled to ensure that women like her lost the things they were trying to hold on to. I want him to stop, she said finally. I want his capacity to do this to me, or to anyone else, to be finished. Whether that requires prosecution or simply the knowledge that the evidence exists and I hold it. She paused. I'd rather he withdrew than be prosecuted. I'd rather he understood that he can't win this and chose to stop than be dragged through proceedings that cost both of us something we don't have to spend. And if he doesn't choose to stop, then we proceed. Baxter nodded. I'll have a letter prepared. It will make the situation very clear. The letter to Sir Edmund went out on the 7th day. Baxter wrote it, but she read every word, and the voice of it was hers. Not vindictive, not triumphant, simply exact. Here is what exists. Here is what it means. Here is what you can do, and what will happen if you don't. His response came not through Partridge, but through a different solicitor, a quieter man named Webb, who had not been involved in any of the preceding business, and whose presence in the correspondence signaled, more clearly than any words could, that Partridge had also withdrawn. The response was 2 paragraphs. It acknowledged that Sir Edmund was withdrawing his complaint. It stated that the outstanding debt notes, the ones purchased through the holding company structure, were being transferred back to their original terms. It contained nothing that admitted wrongdoing, which she had expected and Baxter had told her was standard, and it contained nothing personal, which she had also expected. She read it at the desk in the study of Hartwell House, with the railway projections on one side and the estate ledger on the other, and Clara's footsteps somewhere above her head and the ordinary sounds of the house around her, and she held the letter and understood that it was over. Not everything. Not the debt, which was still real and substantial and would take time. Not the work, which was enormous and would take longer. Not the whispers, which would persist in drawing rooms for years, carried by people who had nothing better to do with their mouths than fill them with other people's stories. But the thing that had been trying to destroy her was over. She set the letter down. She pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed. Then she went to find Mrs. Gaines and told her to let the remaining staff know that their full wages would be paid at the end of the month, without exception, which produced from Mrs. Gaines an expression that was so carefully controlled and so clearly about to break that Evelyn had to look away briefly to give her the space to compose it. Vale came that evening. She had written him a short note that morning. It's done. Edmund has withdrawn. Come tonight if you're free. And he had sent back one word. 7, which was the hour and nothing else, and which she had found, for reasons she didn't examine closely, exactly right. He came at 7, and Mrs. Gaines showed him into the drawing room where the fire was lit properly for the first time since Evelyn had come back to London, burning high and warm and actually heating the room, rather than simply suggesting the possibility of heat. He came in and looked around, at the uncovered furniture, the fire, the shelves that needed filling, the room that had the lived-in quality of a place that was beginning to be used rather than simply inhabited. And he didn't say anything for a moment. It suits you, he said. The house. It needs a great deal of work. Everything worth keeping does. She had wine open on the side table, which was not something she'd done since coming back, and she poured 2 glasses and handed him one, and they stood near the fire in the comfortable and slightly tentative way of 2 people who have been through a great deal together in a very short time and are now in the unfamiliar territory of not having an immediate crisis to navigate. What will you do now? He asked. The railway, first. The projections hold. Calloway agrees. We're on the right timeline. She turned the glass in her hand. Then the tenant cottages, the east wing. The library needs books. She said the last thing with a slight self-consciousness, aware of how it sounded. how small and ordinary compared to everything else. But Vale didn't find it small. He looked at her in a way that was not the professional assessment she'd come to know, not the calculated attention, something more personal than that, and less careful. The library. It's empty. It should have books in it. What kind? She looked at him. Are you genuinely asking? I'm genuinely asking. She thought about it. Mathematics, economics, engineering, history, the kind that doesn't skip the parts that are inconvenient. She paused. And novels, the messy ones where things don't resolve cleanly. Vale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have a library at Ashmore that has almost none of those things. It's full of the correct books, the books a family like mine is supposed to own. He looked at the fire. I've always found it somewhat airless. She laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, slightly surprising to her in the way that genuine laughter is when you haven't done it in a while. The reminder that your body still knows how to make that particular sound, that it was simply waiting for the occasion. Vale looked at her when she laughed, not with the intent look he usually had, something softer than that, something that was simply glad. There's something I want to say, he said, and I want to say it plainly, without dressing it up or surrounding it with conditions. She looked at him. I don't think this, he gestured slightly, meaning the case, the weeks, the whole complicated architecture of what had just concluded, should be the end of whatever this is, between us. He held her gaze. I'm not saying that because I helped. I'm not. This isn't a transaction. I'm saying it because I have spent 6 weeks watching you outthink everyone in a room at least twice, and I find I'm not interested in going back to a version of my life where that isn't happening somewhere nearby. The fire crackled. The house made its quiet structural sounds around them. She looked at him and thought about what Helena had said months ago in a different life. Be careful about what you need from him and what you want from him. They're not always the same thing. She turned it over honestly. The needing was less than it had been. The crisis was resolved, the estate was hers, the immediate threats were gone. What remained was something else, something that had been building under the practical requirements of the preceding weeks, and was now, in the absence of those requirements, simply present. She had spent 3 years telling herself she was done with all of it, with rooms like this, with conversations like this, with the particular vulnerability of being seen by someone and not being entirely certain what they'd do with what they saw. She was not done with it. I'm not easy, she said. Not as a warning, exactly, as information. I have sharp edges. I'm suspicious of things that appear straightforward. I find it difficult to ask for help even when I need it, and I'm aware that this is a problem. She paused. I'm not going to become easier simply because things have gone well. I know that, Vale said. You don't, fully. You've known me for 6 weeks, most of which were a crisis. That's the best possible way to know someone, he said. Crisis strips everything back. What I've seen is what you actually are, not the managed version. He looked at her steadily. And I find what you actually are, worth considerable inconvenience. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me again in 6 months, she said. When the railway is on track and the cottages have tenants and the East Wing isn't a hazard. When things are ordinary. She paused. If you still want to have this conversation in ordinary circumstances, ask me again. Something in his face settled into a decision. All right, he said. 6 months. 6 months, she agreed, and they stood by the fire in the house that was hers and drank their wine and talked about other things, and the evening settled around them with the particular quality of something that is not an ending but a beginning in the process of beginning. Not neat, not complete, but present and real and pointing forward. The northern expansion returns came in at 14 months, which was the exact timeline she had projected, which meant that every established investment house that had dismissed the analysis was now looking at figures that told a different story. Calloway sent her a letter on the day the first substantial payment cleared, which said only, "You were right." She wrote back, "We were right," which was true, and which she wanted him to know she considered true. The tenant cottages were restored over the following year. It was not a smooth process, but there were 3 contractors, 2 disputes, 1 collapse of a section of outbuilding that nobody had anticipated and which cost more to repair than the original estimate for the entire project. She stood in the mud of the east yard on a November afternoon watching 2 men argue about the structural integrity of a wall and thought, quite clearly, this is what I chose, and found that she did not regret it. Helena visited at Christmas. She brought a case of wine she claimed was from her own estate, which Evelyn suspected was slightly more expensive than advertised, and they sat in the library, full, now, of the books Evelyn had selected over months, mathematics and economics and history and the messy novels, and talked for 4 hours without either of them checking the time. Dr. Hale had written, eventually, a letter that she kept in the locked drawer with the few other things she kept there, not because it needed to be hidden, but because it was private. He had written to say that he had been contacted in connection with the case and that he had said what was true, which was that he had examined Lord Hartwell following the accident and that the circumstances were consistent with an accidental fall in a household where, as he stated plainly, the conditions had not been ones he would describe as safe for the occupants. He did not specify what he meant by conditions. He did not need to. He wrote, "I hope you are well and that you remain so." She had written back the same. Fenwick she saw once more, 6 months after the hearing, quite by accident, in a tea room in Holborn, the same one where they'd had their first meeting. He was with a client, and they exchanged a nod across the room, the nod of 2 people who have been involved in something complicated and have arrived at the mutual understanding that the most adult thing is to simply continue existing in the world without requiring the situation to resolve itself into something cleaner than it was. She respected that. It was the version of peace available to them, and it was sufficient. Sir Edmund she did not see. She understood, through the general operations of London social intelligence, that Partridge had ceased to practice within a year, and that Sir Edmund had retreated considerably from public life, and that the holding company through which he had purchased the debt notes had been dissolved. She held the documentation still. Baxter had it, organized and accessible, a record of what had been attempted and what had been found. She had not used it, and she did not intend to, but she was not naive enough to destroy it. The estate, at 18 months, was no longer drowning. It was not, she was careful never to say to anyone, saved. Saved implied completion, a final state, the end of the work. The estate was alive. It was requiring attention and generating income and causing problems and demanding solutions and being, in the most fundamental sense she could identify, a living thing that she was responsible for and invested in and occasionally furious with. This was, she had come to understand, what ownership actually was. Not a destination, but a practice, ongoing and imperfect and deeply hers. Vale asked her again at 6 months, which was the exact interval she had specified, which told her he was also the kind of person who meant what he said precisely and not approximately. It was late spring. The trees in the garden at Hartwell House had come into leaf. She'd had the garden beds cleared and planted the previous autumn, not expensively, not elaborately, simply cleared and planted. And the light on that particular afternoon had the quality of light in late May in London when it actually decides to participate, which it does infrequently and therefore memorably. He came not in the evening, as before, but in the afternoon, and she was in the garden when he arrived, standing in the south bed with her gloves off because she'd been pulling up something that needed pulling and had forgotten she was wearing them. She was not, she was aware, at her most composed. She had dirt on her hands, and possibly on her face, and Clara had stopped mentioning it. He came around the side of the house, Mrs. Gaines had directed him, and stopped when he saw her, and she looked at him and thought about the entrance hall at the Ashford dinner, the second at which their eyes had met, the moment she had clocked him and filed him and moved on. She had not, she understood now, quite moved on. "You said 6 months," he said. "I said 6 months," she agreed. "It's been 6 months. I'm aware." She pulled off the garden gloves and looked at her dirty hands and at him standing there in the late afternoon light, patient in the way she had come to understand was his actual nature rather than a performance of patience, and she thought about what she had told Helena she wanted, to not be afraid anymore, to make something that's mine, that I built, that nobody can take. She had made it. It was hers. Nobody was taking it. and she was standing in the garden of it in May, with dirty hands, being looked at by a man who had seen her at her most reduced and most formidable, and apparently couldn't tell the difference in the way that mattered to him. And she understood that this, too, this particular thing she'd been holding at arm's length for 6 months, was something she had been building toward without quite permitting herself to name it. "Yes," she said. Vale looked at her. "Yes to—" "Yes," she said again, more definitively. "I'm not saying it 3 times. Something happened on his face that she had not seen there before. Not the contained, managed quality he usually wore, but something genuinely unguarded, something that was simply glad in the plain and undefended way of a person who has wanted something and is now looking at it. It lasted only a moment before his composure reassembled itself, but she had seen it, and she filed it the way she filed everything, and she found she was glad she had. "Right," he said then. "You have dirt on your face." She looked at him. "Just there." He gestured vaguely toward his own cheekbone. She wiped at her face with the back of her wrist, which almost certainly made it worse. He watched this without comment, which she appreciated. "Come inside," she said. "Mrs. Gaines has been expecting you, I think. She made the good biscuits." He walked with her toward the house. The garden was imperfect. There were beds that needed more attention, a section of path that was uneven, a rose that hadn't come back as expected and would need replacing. The house behind it was imperfect too. The east wing was better but not finished, and the library's south window let in a draft when the wind came from the wrong direction, and there was a floor tile in the kitchen passage that had been loose for 6 months and kept not being repaired. It was all imperfect, and it was all hers, and it was all pointing forward. She stepped through the kitchen door of Hartwell House in late May, with the garden coming in behind her and the sounds of the house ahead of her, and she understood that the woman who had walked into the Ashford Ballroom 7 months ago with 3 years of exile and a drowning estate and a past she could not outrun had not in fact been rescued from any of it. She had faced it. She had built through it. She had made the thing and held the thing, and when the system tried to take it, she had made the system answer for what it was doing. The past had not disappeared. It was there, in the locked drawer, in the documents Baxter held, in the knowledge that Mrs. Parr lived in Stepney, and Dr. Hale was in Cheltenham, and Fenwick was somewhere in London doing whatever he did next. It was there in the story people still told, half wrong and half right, and entirely outside her control. It was there in her, in the specific way that things you have survived become part of the architecture of what you are. She had stopped running from it, and standing in the kitchen of her own house on a May afternoon, she found she was not afraid.